There is a place in the American Southwest where the stone walls of entire cities still stand. Not ruins exactly, not collapsed rubble, not a few scattered foundation stones that archaeologists rope off and label with laminated signs. Actual walls, actual doorways, actual rooms carved into the faces of sheer sandstone cliffs hundreds of feet above the canyon floor, where wind has been threading through the same window openings for 700 years, and the plaster that ancient hands smoothed onto the interior surfaces still carries the prints of those hands. If you look closely enough in the right light, these places exist. You can visit them. You can walk through them, or at least most of them, because the National Park Service manages the accessible ones and has built ranger stations and visitor centers nearby, with gift shops selling turquoise jewelry and glossy paperback guides. And in those paperback guides, you will find the official story, the sanitized, committee-approved, academically acceptable version of what happened here. Neatly packaged for the family road trip, digestible in 20 minutes before you drive to the next scenic overlook. The official story goes something like this. A people called the ancestral Puebloans, whom earlier generations called the Anasazi, built these cliff dwellings between roughly 900 and 1300 CE. They were sophisticated farmers who terraced the canyon slopes, diverted water into irrigation channels, grew corn and squash and beans, developed complex pottery traditions, and traded across vast distances. Then, around 1300, a great drought struck. The rains failed for years, the crops withered, the people abandoned their cities and migrated south, eventually becoming the ancestors of the modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona.
The stories
End
of
of
our
story.
ancestors
Mystery
held in
solved.
this land
Move
guide
along.
us still.
But if you stand at the edge
We
of the
must
canyon
carry
at
them
Mesa
forward.
Verde, or peer into the shadows of the alcoves at Chaco Canyon, or feel the weight of the silence pressing against you inside the chambers of Betatakin, you will feel something the pamphlet does not mention. You will feel that the official story leaves something enormous out. Not just one thing, dozens of things. Hundreds of unanswered questions that serious researchers have been asking for a century and a half. Questions that get quietly redirected, minimized, dismissed, or buried under the avalanche of peer-reviewed consensus that says everything is already figured out. This video is about those questions. This video is about the things the textbooks leave out. The evidence that does not fit the comfortable narrative. The patterns in the archaeology that point towards something more complex, more ancient, more mysterious, and in some ways more disturbing than the story we were all handed in school. This is not a video about aliens. This is not a video about conspiracy theories in the paranoid internet sense. This is a video about archaeology, about physical evidence, about the testimony of the land itself, and about the long, uncomfortable history of powerful institutions deciding what the public is allowed to know about the people who came before them. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always read the comments, and there is something that moves me deeply about knowing that someone in Tokyo, and someone in Manchester, and someone in rural Montana are all drifting off to the same ancient mysteries at the same moment, connected by curiosity across 12 time zones and 3 continents. So tell me where you are. I will be reading. Now, let us go back. Way back. Further back than the pamphlet takes you. The textbook version of pre-Columbian North America has a habit of beginning the serious human story around 500 CE at the earliest. As if the continent were essentially empty and uninteresting before then, as if the tens of thousands of years of human presence before the Roman Empire reached its peak were just a long, featureless prologue of nomadic wanderers too simple to matter. This is not just an oversimplification. It is a distortion so profound that it shapes the entire way we understand what America is and was and could have been. The land that would eventually be called the American Southwest was occupied continuously for at least 13,000 years before the cliff dwellings were built. 13,000 years is not a number that fits easily in the human imagination. Consider that the entire span of recorded human civilization, from the first Sumerian writing tablets to this moment, is roughly 5,000 years. The people of the Southwest had been living on that land for nearly 3 times that length before anyone carved the first stone into the face of a canyon wall. They were not wandering aimlessly. They were not bumbling primitively through an indifferent landscape. They were learning. They were accumulating knowledge across generations in the way that all complex cultures accumulate knowledge, through observation, through experiment, through the painful education of failure, and through the slow refinement of success. They were building relationships with the land so intimate and so detailed that they could predict, with a precision that would impress a modern meteorologist, exactly how the shadow of a particular canyon wall would fall on a particular day of the year and what that meant for the planting season. The people archaeologists call the basket makers were here at least 3,000 years ago, weaving extraordinary containers from plant fibers with a technical sophistication that took later researchers decades to fully understand. They were not making baskets because they had nothing better to do. They were solving engineering problems of storage and transport and water management, in a landscape where water was the most precious substance in the universe, and losing it was death. Their baskets were so tightly woven that they could hold water. Think about that for a moment. They were making waterproof containers from plant fibers, and they were doing it with a consistency and a quality that suggests not individual genius, but systematic, transmitted knowledge, the kind of knowledge that gets passed down through formal apprenticeship, through ceremony, through the deep cultural memory of a people who understood that forgetting how to do something correctly could kill your grandchildren. By 2,000 years ago, the people of the Four Corners region, where Utah and Colorado and Arizona and New Mexico meet at a single point that you can stand on and touch 4 states simultaneously, were already engaging in long-distance trade networks that connected them to cultures hundreds and thousands of miles away. Shells from the Gulf of California were showing up in canyon sites in southern Colorado. Copper bells from the Mexican highlands were appearing in New Mexico. Macaws, tropical parrots whose nearest natural habitat was hundreds of miles south, were being kept in captivity in canyon communities, their feathers harvested for ceremonial regalia. This is not the behavior of isolated primitive bands scratching for survival. This is the behavior of a civilization with enough surplus production to support specialized traders, enough political stability to maintain trade relationships across vast distances, enough cultural sophistication to assign high ceremonial value to exotic goods, and enough organizational capacity to maintain living animals that required specific diet and care in an environment completely alien to the animal's natural range. But none of this appears in the standard textbook narrative with the weight it deserves. In the standard telling, the prehistory of the Southwest is a brief background paragraph before the main event, which is always Columbus, always 1492, always the European encounter as the point where real American history begins. Everything before that is prologue. Everything before that is prehistory, which is another way of saying history that does not quite count. Here is the first lie of omission. The Four Corners region did not suddenly spring into complexity around 900 CE. The extraordinary civilization that built the cliff cities was the culmination of thousands of years of accumulated development, and understanding why that civilization made the specific choices it made, including the breathtaking, almost incomprehensible choice to build entire cities in the faces of cliffs, requires understanding what came before it. And understanding what came before it requires looking at evidence that is inconvenient for the simple story the textbook wants to tell. Let us begin with Chaco Canyon. Chaco Canyon sits in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, a place so remote and so desolate that even today, with modern roads and GPS navigation, it takes over an hour of driving on unpaved washboard roads to reach the main ruins from the nearest highway. In wet weather, those roads become impassable. In winter, the canyon is frequently cut off entirely. The nearest town of any size is 50 miles away. There are no gas stations in Chaco. There are no convenience stores. There is no cell phone signal for most of the approach. Chaco Canyon is, in the most literal sense possible, the middle of nowhere. And in that middle of nowhere, between roughly 850 and 1150 CE, the people archaeologists call the Chacoans built something that should not exist. Pueblo Bonito is the largest of the great houses at Chaco Canyon. When it was complete, it contained somewhere between 600 and 800 rooms arranged in a D-shaped plan that covered more than 2 acres of canyon floor and rose to 4 and 5 stories at its back wall. The rooms were not random accumulations added piecemeal by different families at different times. They were planned. The entire structure shows evidence of having been conceived as a unified whole before a single stone was laid, and then executed according to that conception over a period of approximately 200 years by successive generations of builders who adhered to the original plan with a fidelity that suggests it held sacred or at least deeply authoritative significance. The stone masonry of Pueblo Bonito is, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary. Different sections of the building were constructed using different masonry styles, and archaeologists have used these style variations to date the different construction phases. But even the earliest sections show a level of technical precision that archaeologists spent decades arguing about before reaching anything like consensus. The walls are built using a core and veneer technique in which a rubble core is faced with carefully shaped and fitted stone. The facing stones were not just stacked, they were shaped. Each one was selected or modified to fit its specific location in the wall. The result is a surface of extraordinary regularity, with stones fitting together so tightly that in many sections you cannot insert a knife blade into the joints. For a long time, the official explanation for this precision was that the Chacoans had simply had a lot of time and were very patient. More recent analysis has suggested something more interesting. Studies of the tool marks on the shaped stones reveal systematic patterns that indicate specialized stonecutters working according to explicit standards, not individual craftsmen making individual aesthetic choices, but workers operating within a defined technical framework that controlled for specific dimensions and finish qualities. In other words, there was quality control, there were standards, there was something that functioned, at minimum, like a guild of specialized builders operating under institutional direction. Pueblo Bonito alone would be remarkable, but Pueblo Bonito is not alone. Within Chaco Canyon and on the canyon rim above it, there are 12 great houses, each one a massive, planned, multi-story structure of sophisticated masonry. The smallest of them would have been the most impressive building in most communities of their era. Together, they represent an investment of labor and material and organizational capacity that, per capita of the estimated population, rivals the construction programs of much larger and more historically celebrated civilizations. But here is where it gets genuinely strange. The buildings at Chaco Canyon are aligned, not casually or approximately aligned, precisely aligned. Pueblo Bonito's back wall runs precisely east to west. The Great Kiva, the large circular ceremonial chamber, is positioned so that its walls catch the rising sun on the summer solstice and the winter solstice at geometrically significant points. The doorways in specific rooms frame the sunrise at the equinoxes. The shadow of a carefully placed spiral petroglyph on a nearby cliff face catches the edge of a specific stone at noon on the summer solstice in a way that requires the petroglyph to have been placed with astronomical precision. This is not coincidence. This is not accident. Someone, many someones, working across generations, built and maintained a system of astronomical observation and calendrical marking at Chaco Canyon that required sustained, sophisticated, mathematically literate engagement with the movements of celestial bodies. And it does not stop there. Radiating outward from Chaco Canyon in multiple directions, archaeologists have mapped a network of roads. These are not trails worn by foot traffic. They are constructed roads, deliberately built with defined edges, excavated to a consistent depth below the surrounding terrain, sometimes cut through solid rock to maintain their straight-line course. The roads are remarkably straight, far straighter than topography alone would demand, suggesting that the builders had a method for maintaining straight lines across terrain that they could not see end to end. The roads extend for dozens of miles in some directions. They connect Chaco Canyon to outlier communities scattered across a region of more than 25,000 square miles. At certain points, the roads pass through carefully constructed stairways cut into cliff faces. At other points, they approach the edges of mesas and simply stop, as if the continuation was understood to lie elsewhere, on a different plane of existence, or as if the road itself was not primarily a practical route for foot traffic, but a ceremonial axis, whose meaning lay in its direction rather than its destination. The largest road, called the Great North Road by archaeologists, runs almost perfectly north from Chaco Canyon for more than 30 miles. There is nothing at the end of it, at least nothing that survives or that has been identified as its obvious destination. Why would you build a perfectly straight ceremonial road 30 miles through difficult desert terrain to reach nothing? What was the road for? What did north mean to the Chacoans? These are not rhetorical questions. Researchers have been asking them for decades. The answers that have been proposed range from the plausible to the fascinating to the genuinely unsettling. Some researchers have argued that the roads were pilgrimage routes, that the act of walking the road was itself the purpose, a form of moving meditation or ceremonial expression. Others have suggested that the roads were intended to channel something that is not foot traffic, not goods, not people, but something more abstract and more important: power, spiritual energy, ancestral connection, the attention of forces that the Chacoans believed inhabited the cardinal directions. These are not lunatic fringe interpretations. These are serious archaeological hypotheses advanced by credentialed researchers publishing in peer-reviewed journals. And the reason these hypotheses have traction is that the physical evidence at Chaco Canyon is genuinely difficult to explain in purely utilitarian terms. If the roads were for moving goods and people efficiently, they would not need to be so straight. You can move goods efficiently along a winding road. Straightness has a cost in construction effort that only makes sense if straightness itself was the point. If the buildings were simply for housing a large population, they would not need to be astronomically aligned, and they would not need to be built to the exceptional masonry standards that Chaco builders maintained. Standard construction is good enough for housing. You only build to extraordinary standards when extraordinary standards mean something. Chaco Canyon was not a city in the modern sense. It may not even have been primarily a residential site at all. The best current evidence, including studies of the skeletal remains found in the buildings, the pollen and macrobotanical evidence from the trash deposits, and the trace element signatures in the food remains, suggests that Chaco Canyon was occupied by a relatively small permanent population and was periodically visited by very large numbers of people from across the regional network. It was, in the most precise sense of the word, a ceremonial center, a pilgrimage destination, a place where people came from hundreds of miles away to participate in events of religious or political or economic significance that required the presence of this specific place. This is a radically different picture than the textbook presents. The textbook says, in essence, that Chaco Canyon was a town, a somewhat impressive pre-Columbian town in the desert, that grew and eventually was abandoned. The archaeological evidence says that Chaco Canyon was the center of something, a polity, a religious system, a network of social obligation and ceremonial practice that extended across tens of thousands of square miles and coordinated the activities of tens of thousands of people across generations. And then it ended, abruptly, in ways that the evidence is still struggling to fully explain. Around 1150 CE, construction at Chaco Canyon stopped, not slowed, stopped. The great building program that had been underway for 300 years simply ceased. The roads were not extended. The great houses were not expanded. The outlier communities that had been feeding turquoise and timber and pottery and other goods into the Chacoan system began to shift their orientation, to reorient away from the canyon center and toward new regional centers that were emerging to the north and east. The population that had sustained the Chacoan pilgrimage economy began to disperse, to fragment, to redirect its energy toward different places and different kinds of social organization. Why? What happened around 1150 CE that was severe enough to end a 300-year building program and redirect the energy of an entire regional civilization? The drought hypothesis is the first thing the textbook reaches for, and there is genuine evidence for drought in the mid-12th century. Tree ring studies from the region, which can reconstruct annual precipitation patterns going back centuries with remarkable precision, do show a significant dry period around 1130 to 1180. The rains were less reliable during this period. The crops would have been stressed. Food security would have been a serious concern. But here is the problem with the drought explanation. The Southwest had experienced droughts before. The entire history of human occupation in the region is a history of adapting to drought, of developing drought-resistant crops, of engineering water management systems, of moving strategically in response to shifting rainfall patterns. The basket makers survived drought. The early Pueblo people survived drought. The Chacoans themselves had navigated drought conditions earlier in the developmental period, before the great house construction peak. Drought alone does not adequately explain why a 300-year-old civilization whose entire organizational genius was built around managing scarcity suddenly collapsed in a way it had never collapsed before. Something else was happening, something the drought may have exacerbated but did not by itself create. Recent bioarchaeological work at Chaco Canyon has produced findings that are not prominently featured in the family-friendly visitor center exhibits. Studies of the skeletal remains from the great houses, particularly from Pueblo Bonito, have revealed patterns of nutritional stress, of violence, and of social stratification that paint a picture dramatically different from the harmonious agricultural community the standard narrative favors. Some of the burials at Pueblo Bonito are extraordinary. A small number of individuals were buried with literally hundreds of pieces of turquoise jewelry, with quantities of shell and worked bone and exotic goods that represent wealth on a scale completely disproportionate to anything else in the regional archaeological record. These individuals were tall, well-nourished, apparently healthy. They had spent their lives in comfort. Other individuals at the same site tell a different story. Skeletal analysis reveals chronic nutritional deficiency, signs of heavy physical labor beginning in childhood, evidence of anemia from parasitic load, and pathologies associated with lives of sustained physical stress. These are people who worked very hard and did not eat very well. And then there is the violence. At a site called Salmon Ruin, a Chacoan outlier community in northern New Mexico, researchers found evidence of a massacre. Dozens of individuals, including many children, died violently, and their remains were deposited in a manner suggesting deliberate, organized killing rather than the scattered losses of normal conflict. At another site, human bones bearing cut marks and evidence of burning were found in a context that has provoked serious debate about the interpretation. Were these remains the evidence of cannibalism? Were they the remains of witchcraft victims, processed in the specific way that Pueblo tradition prescribed for the bodies of dangerous sorcerers? Were they warfare trophies? The physical evidence is unambiguous. The interpretation is desperately contested, not because the bones are ambiguous, but because the implications of different interpretations are so uncomfortable. The picture that emerges from this evidence is not the picture of a peaceful, egalitarian farming community disrupted by drought. It is the picture of a hierarchical society, perhaps one with a priestly or chiefly elite that controlled access to ritual knowledge, sacred spaces, exotic goods, and the organizational capacity of the broader network, a society that had, over the centuries of Chacoan florescence, developed significant social stratification and perhaps began to fray from internal tensions as much as, or more than, from external environmental pressure. This is important. This matters enormously for understanding what came next, because what came next was the cliff cities. Think about it for a moment from a purely architectural and practical standpoint. You are a farmer in the Four Corners region in the late 1100s or early 1200s. You have been farming canyon-bottom agricultural plots, living in surface villages near your fields, for generations. This is where you have always lived. This is where your ancestors lived. The fields are at the canyon floor. The water sources are at the canyon floor. The most fertile soil is at the canyon floor. Everything that sustains you physically is at the canyon floor. And then, at some point, you or your community makes a decision. You are going to move your home into the cliff. Not near the cliff. Not close to the cliff face where you can look out over the canyon comfortably from a ledge. Into the cliff, into narrow, shadowed alcoves that are in some cases accessible only by handheld toeholds carved into sheer rock faces, where you will have to carry every drop of water and every handful of food up that rock face on your back, where the ceiling is bare rock, where the light is limited, where winter brings cold that concentrates in the stone and lingers, where you are, in a very practical sense, trapped if anything approaches from above. Why would anyone do that? Why would a population that had been farming and living successfully in canyon-bottom villages for generations suddenly invest extraordinary labor in moving their homes to the most defensively advantageous but practically inconvenient locations in the landscape? The textbook says drought. The textbook says resource pressure, population stress, the need to move to higher ground to find new agricultural opportunities. And all of these factors probably played a role, but they do not explain the extraordinary nature of the choice. Drought does not make you build your home in a cliff face accessible only by handheld toeholds. Drought makes you move to a better watered location. Population stress does not make you choose the hardest possible construction environment in the most physically demanding location. Population stress makes you look for easier solutions first. The thing that makes you put your home in a cliff face, high above the canyon floor, with a 90-foot drop between you and anyone approaching from below, is fear. Specifically, fear of other people. Fear severe enough that the practical inconveniences of cliff life, the back-breaking water carrying, the dangerous daily commute to your fields, the cramped dark living spaces, the constant physical demand of climbing to and from your own home, were considered acceptable trade-offs for the defensive advantage that the cliff provided. This is the second lie of omission in the textbook narrative. The cliff cities were not built because the people who built them were searching for better agricultural opportunities or experimenting with new architectural forms. The cliff cities were fortresses. They were built by people who had reason to fear attack and who made the rational, if exhausting, decision that living in a defensively superior position was worth the enormous practical costs that position imposed. Who were they afraid of? Here, the archaeology becomes genuinely complex and the academic debate becomes genuinely heated. The population movements of the late 12th and early 13th centuries in the southwest were massive and largely not well understood. People were moving. Large communities that had been stable for generations were dispersing. New communities were forming in new places. The regional network that had organized around Chaco was breaking down and new organizational centers were emerging. All of this movement meant that the social landscape, the network of communities that knew each other, traded with each other, had established relationships and obligations with each other, was in flux. New groups were appearing in territories where they had not previously been present. Old alliances were breaking down. The social buffers that normally modulated conflict between groups were weakening as the groups themselves were moving and changing. In this context, building your home in a cliff face begins to make a great deal of sense. You are not just protecting yourself from a known enemy. You are protecting yourself from a landscape in which the rules of social engagement are in flux, in which you do not know who will show up in your canyon, what their intentions might be, or whether the relationships that previously guaranteed peaceful interaction still hold. But the archaeology suggests more than just general social anxiety. At a number of cliff-dwelling sites, researchers have found evidence of deliberate construction specifically designed for defense in ways that go far beyond simply being inconveniently located. Doorways were reduced in size, sometimes to openings so small that only a single person could pass through at a time, crawling. Walls were built across the approaches to alcoves in ways that created narrow choke points. Ground floor doors and windows were blocked or eliminated in the later occupation phases of some sites. Rooftops were accessed through hatches rather than external doors. Certain rooms show evidence of having been used specifically as lookout positions, with sightlines deliberately oriented toward the most likely approach routes into the canyon. These are not the defensive measures of people experiencing vague social anxiety. These are the defensive measures of people who have had specific experience of violence and have designed their homes specifically to make that violence as difficult as possible to inflict. And the skeletal evidence from cliff-dwelling sites confirms it. A site in southeastern Utah called Castle Rock Pueblo shows evidence of a violent episode near the end of its occupation. Multiple individuals with wounds consistent with blunt force trauma, some with embedded projectile points, were left in the ruins of the site's final occupation phase. The bodies were not buried. They were left where they fell, which in the context of ancestral Puebloan mortuary practice, where proper burial was of deep cultural importance, suggests that there was no one left to bury them. Castle Rock was not an isolated case. Across the cliff-dwelling region, the final decades of occupation at multiple sites show similar patterns of trauma, of unburied dead, of rapid abandonment, of burning, of evidence that the departure from these laboriously constructed cliff homes was not the orderly, planned migration that the textbook describes, but something closer to flight. Something happened in the late 13th century in the Four Corners region. Something violent enough that communities which had invested decades of extraordinary labor in building defensible cliff homes abandoned those homes and never came back. Something severe enough that the dead were left unburied in the rooms where they fell. Something that ended not just one community, but dozens of communities across a region spanning tens of thousands of square miles. The textbook calls it the Great Drought and describes a peaceful voluntary migration south. The Archaeology calls it something considerably more complicated and considerably more disturbing. Let us pause here and talk about something that the textbook absolutely does not want to talk about. Let us talk about who was doing what to whom, and why that question has been so difficult for mainstream archaeology to answer honestly. For most of the 20th century, the prevailing interpretation of the ancestral Puebloan cliff dwellings and their abandonment was dominated by a narrative that, with the benefit of hindsight, we can recognize as shaped by ideological assumptions as much as by evidence. The assumption was that the pre-Columbian Southwest was, whatever its other complexities, essentially peaceful. The narrative of the peaceful, agricultural, spiritually sophisticated Pueblo people was enormously appealing, both to the general public and to many researchers, partly because it offered a counterpoint to the violence-centered narratives of European conquest that dominated the larger story of American history, and partly because the descendants of the cliff dwellers, the modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, had cultivated and maintained a public image of peaceful spirituality that served their own cultural and political interests in negotiating their place in the modern American landscape. This is not a criticism of the modern Pueblo peoples. Their strategic self-presentation in a difficult political environment has been extraordinarily successful and has served their communities well. But it created a situation in which the archaeological evidence of violence in the pre-Columbian Southwest was systematically underinterpreted, explained away, or simply not emphasized in the public presentation of the research. The work of Christy Turner and Jacqueline Turner on what they called man-corn, published in 1999, broke this pattern in a way that made the archaeological establishment genuinely uncomfortable. The Turners documented, with exhaustive physical evidence, more than 70 cases of what they argued was systematic violence, including cannibalism, in the pre-Columbian Southwest. They argued, controversially, that this violence was not random or episodic but showed patterns consistent with the activities of a specific group, which they identified as associated with the Chacoan regional system, and which they suggested used ritualized terror and violence as a tool of social control. The response from the archaeological establishment was furious. The Turners were accused of sensationalism, of misinterpreting the evidence, of imposing modern Western categories on behavior that had entirely different cultural meaning, of ignoring the dignity and cultural rights of the living descendants of the people whose ancestors they were studying. Some of these criticisms had merit. Some of them were legitimate, methodological objections. And some of them were, if we are being honest, motivated by discomfort with the implications of the research rather than genuine scientific disagreement. Because the evidence that something violent, systematic, and deeply disturbing was happening in parts of the pre-Columbian Southwest is not the Turners' invention. It existed before their work, and it has continued to accumulate since. Site 13, excavated in the 1990s near Cowboy Wash in southwestern Colorado, produced the skeletal remains of multiple individuals who had been processed in ways consistent with butchering for consumption. The bones had been cut in specific ways, with cut marks in locations associated with meat removal rather than with bone tool manufacture. Marrow had been extracted. Some bones showed evidence of having been placed in cooking pots. And when researchers conducted analysis of the soil in a cooking hearth at the site, they found something that silenced even the most committed skeptics. Coprolite residue containing human myoglobin, a protein specific to human muscle tissue that would have no other explanation for its presence in a cooking hearth. Someone at Cowboy Wash, around 1150 CE, cooked and ate human beings. The question of why is still genuinely contested. The Turner interpretation that this was systematic terror inflicted by agents of the Chacoan elite has not been universally accepted. Alternative interpretations include survival cannibalism during extreme food stress, mortuary practices with cultural significance very different from modern Western assumptions, and ritualized treatment of the bodies of individuals categorized as witches or dangerous sorcerers, a practice that later Pueblo traditions explicitly describe, and that specifically involved processing the body in ways that would prevent the dangerous spiritual entity from continuing to harm the community. But regardless of which interpretation is correct, or most correct, or correct in different instances, the physical evidence of extreme violence in the late Chacoan period is not a fringe interpretation. It is archaeological fact, documented at multiple sites, analyzed by multiple researchers, confirmed by multiple lines of evidence, and the textbook does not mention it. The visitor center exhibit does not mention it. The family-friendly pamphlet definitely does not mention it. This is a choice. It is a choice made by institutions and by individuals within those institutions who have decided, consciously or unconsciously, that the sanitized narrative is preferable to the complicated one. And the effect of that choice is that millions of people who visit Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon and Canyon de Chelly every year leave those places with a false understanding of what happened there and why, with a story that is tidier and simpler and more comfortable than the truth the evidence actually points toward. We will return to this. But first, let us go somewhere that the textbook version barely acknowledges at all. Let us go to the places that were here before Chaco, before the cliff cities, before the cultural fluorescence that the textbooks do deign to mention. Let us go to the deep time of the Southwest, to the evidence that pushes the human story in this landscape back far beyond where the comfortable narrative wants to start. In 1996, a set of ancient human bones was discovered eroding from a riverbank near Kennewick, Washington, a long way from the Southwest, but critical to understanding the larger story of who was really here first and when. The bones were old, far older than anything the standard narrative comfortably accommodates, radiocarbon dated to approximately 9,300 years before the present. The skeleton was remarkably complete and remarkably well preserved, and when physical anthropologists examined it, they noted features of the skull and skeleton that did not fit neatly into the expected morphological profile of the ancestors of modern Native American populations. The scientific and legal battle over Kennewick Man, as the skeleton came to be called, lasted nearly a decade and generated more political controversy than almost any other archaeological discovery in American history. Multiple Native American tribes claimed the remains for repatriation and reburial under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, arguing that Kennewick Man was an ancestor. Researchers argued that the skeleton was of sufficient scientific significance and uncertain enough affiliation to warrant detailed study before repatriation. The Army Corps of Engineers initially seized the bones and prepared to hand them over without any study. Researchers sued. The courts ruled in favor of scientific study. Years of research followed, producing a body of findings that were genuinely surprising and that pushed the academic conversation about the first Americans in directions that nobody had anticipated. The morphological features of Kennewick Man's skull were eventually interpreted, through careful and contested analysis, as being most similar not to the expected Northeast Asian ancestry of most Native American populations, but to populations associated with coastal Southeast Asia and Australasia. This suggested that the peopling of the Americas was more complex than the simple Bering land bridge model, that the first people to reach the Western Hemisphere may have been more diverse in their origins than previously recognized, and that the ancestry of the people who eventually developed the cliff city cultures of the Southwest was not a simple, linear story from one point of origin. This is a story the mainstream narrative finds uncomfortable because it complicates the moral clarity of modern Indigenous rights discourse, which depends on a relatively simple story of original and continuous occupation. The archaeological and genetic evidence increasingly suggests that the real story of who came first, and from where, and in what relationship to the people who came later, is considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. But let us bring this back specifically to the Southwest, because the Southwest has its own deep time puzzles that the textbook narrative glosses over almost entirely. In a limestone cave in southern New Mexico called Pendejo Cave, a series of excavations in the early 1990s produced what the lead researcher, Richard McNeish, argued were the oldest archaeological deposits in North America, with radiocarbon dates reaching back potentially 30,000 years or more. The findings included fragmentary human fingerprints preserved in ancient clay, stone tools in stratigraphic contexts associated with the ancient dates, and other evidence of human presence. McNeish was one of the most distinguished archaeologists in the history of the discipline, the man who had documented the origins of corn domestication in Mexico, a researcher with decades of experience and a reputation built on rigorous fieldwork. And the archaeological establishment largely rejected his Pendejo Cave findings. Not because the physical evidence was demonstrably wrong, but because the dates were too old, too uncomfortable, too far outside the accepted framework of American prehistory. This is a pattern that repeats itself throughout the history of American archaeology. A researcher finds evidence that humans were present in the Americas earlier than the prevailing model says they should have been. The establishment pushes back hard. The researcher's methodology is scrutinized, the dating methods are challenged, alternative explanations for the evidence are advanced. Sometimes the challenges are legitimate, and the early dates do not survive rigorous examination. But sometimes the challenges seem motivated as much by the desire to protect the existing paradigm as by genuine methodological concerns. The Clovis first model, the idea that the first people to enter the Americas were the Clovis people around 13,000 years ago, was archaeological dogma for most of the 20th century. It was not just a hypothesis, it was treated as established fact, and researchers who proposed evidence for earlier human presence were systematically marginalized. Then, in the 1990s and 2000s, multiple sites began producing pre-Clovis evidence that was too robust, too well documented, and too thoroughly analyzed to dismiss. Monteverde in Chile, with its pre-Clovis occupation dating to at least 14,500 years ago, Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, with disputed evidence of occupation possibly reaching back 16,000 years or more. The Buttermilk Creek Complex in Texas, with stone tools in contexts dating to between 13,000 to 115,500 years ago. The first Americans' model had to change, and it did, reluctantly, dragged into revision by the weight of accumulating evidence against its will. What does this have to do with the cliff cities? Everything. Because if the human presence in the Americas, and specifically in the Southwest, is older, deeper, and more complex than the textbook admits, then the cultural trajectory that eventually produced Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde and Canyon de Chelly is longer, richer, and more mysterious than the simplified timeline suggests. The Cliff City builders were not a sudden cultural flowering emerging from a simple, recent background. They were the latest expression of a deep human engagement with a specific landscape, an engagement that stretched back not hundreds, but thousands of years longer than the comfortable story acknowledges. And there are specific sites in the Southwest that push this engagement back in ways that deserve far more attention than they receive. Sandia Cave in New Mexico produced, in excavations conducted in the 1930s and 1940s, what the excavator Frank Hibben argued were artifacts from a pre-Clovis occupation. Hibben's methodology was subsequently criticized and his findings were largely rejected, in part because Hibben himself was later caught in documented cases of archaeological fabrication that permanently damaged his credibility. But some researchers have argued that the rejection of the Sandia findings was too wholesale, that the methodological problems with Hibben's work do not necessarily mean that all of the evidence from Sandia Cave should be dismissed, and that the cave deserves renewed, rigorous excavation with modern methods. This is what makes the archaeology of the pre-Columbian Southwest so frustrating and so fascinating simultaneously. The institutional history of the discipline is deeply entangled with individual careers and reputations, with funding structures that reward publication of findings consistent with established paradigms and penalize findings that challenge them, with the complex politics of relations between academic institutions and Native American communities, and with the basic human tendency of experts to be more comfortable defending existing consensus than entertaining genuinely disruptive ideas. Disentangling the evidence from all of this is difficult, painstaking work, and it is work that is ongoing, that is not complete, that continues to produce surprises. One of the most significant recent surprises came from a site in New Mexico called Chiquito Springs, where researchers analyzing surface-collected stone tools found technological signatures suggesting manufacture techniques associated with much older stone tool traditions than ancestral Puebloan technologies. The interpretation of these findings remains contested, but they point toward the possibility that the landscape of the Southwest was occupied by culturally distinct populations with different technological traditions and potentially different ancestral relationships over a far longer time span than the standard narrative accommodates. All of this deep background matters when we try to understand the cliff cities because it reminds us that the people who built those cities were not isolated, were not starting from nothing, were not simple agricultural communities that had recently arrived in a landscape they were only beginning to understand. They were the inheritors of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about that specific land, that specific climate, those specific resources, and when we look at what they built, at the extraordinary sophistication of the Chacoan road system and the astronomical alignments and the masonry traditions, and ask how a so-called primitive agricultural society produced all of this, the answer is simpler and more obvious than the textbook implies. They were not primitive, and they did not produce it overnight. Now let us talk about the Hohokam, because the Hohokam are another group whose story the textbook simplifies so severely that the simplification becomes its own kind of falsehood. The Hohokam occupied the Sonoran Desert of what is now southern Arizona for roughly 2,000 years, from around 300 BCE to roughly 1,450 CE. Their civilization was based in one of the harshest environments in North America, a desert where summer temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and annual rainfall is measured in single-digit inches. And in that desert, they built something that is, by any engineering standard, remarkable. An irrigation system so extensive and so sophisticated that it has never been fully mapped. The Hohokam Canal system in the Salt River and Gila River valleys extended, by the most conservative estimates, over 1,000 miles of main canal channel. More recent surveys, using aerial photography and ground-penetrating radar to identify buried canals, suggests that the total length of the system may have been several times that. The canals were not simple ditches. They were engineered structures with carefully calculated gradients to maintain the precise flow rate needed to move water without sedimentation clogging the channel, with diversion structures to control the direction and volume of water flow, with head gates to regulate intake from the rivers, with lateral branches that distributed water to individual fields, and with maintenance provisions that required organized, coordinated labor on an ongoing basis. At its maximum extent, the Hohokam Canal system may have irrigated over 100,000 acres of desert land and supported a population of somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people. This is not a number that fits easily into the standard narrative of small-scale, pre-agricultural or early agricultural communities in the pre-Columbian Southwest. A population of 80,000 people sustained by a complex irrigation system that required coordinated maintenance across hundreds of miles of canal is an urban phenomenon. It is the kind of population concentration that, in the Old World, we would unhesitatingly call a civilization. But the Hohokam are not taught as a civilization in the standard curriculum. They are taught, if they are taught at all, as one of several regional cultures of the pre-Columbian Southwest. Interesting, but not particularly significant, without the drama and the mystery of the cliff dwellers further north. The canal system is acknowledged but not emphasized. The population estimates are mentioned but not contextualized, and the collapse of the Hohokam system around 1,450, even more mysterious and more complete than the abandonment of the cliff cities, is attributed to drought and flooding, which is partially true but which, again, leaves out the evidence suggesting that something more complex and more violent was also happening. In the larger regional context, the Hohokam, the ancestral Puebloans of the Four Corners, and the Mogollon people of the mountain country between them were not independent, isolated cultural units developing in parallel without significant interaction. They were parts of an interconnected regional system, trading with each other, sharing innovations, experiencing each other's instabilities and crises. The collapse of the Chicoan system in the 12th century sent shockwaves through the entire regional network, and the subsequent population movements and social reorganizations affected Hohokam territory as well as ancestral Puebloan territory. Understanding any one of these groups in isolation, as the textbook invariably does because it is easier to write a textbook that way, means missing the most important story, which is the story of how these different cultural systems interacted, how they influenced each other, how the tensions and transformations in one part of the regional network propagated through the whole, and how the eventual, near-total collapse of organized life in large areas of the Southwest in the late 13th and 14th centuries was a regional catastrophe, not the sum of a series of independent local crises. Let us now go to the place that, of all the cliff-dwelling sites in the Southwest, has generated the most sustained controversy and the most uncomfortable archaeological questions. Let us go to Mesa Verde. Mesa Verde is a flat-topped mountain, a mesa, in southwestern Colorado. It is, by any standard, one of the most spectacular archaeological sites in the Western Hemisphere. The cliff dwellings built into the alcoves along its canyon sides are extraordinarily well preserved. The combination of the sheltering, overhanging cliff and the extremely dry climate, having maintained walls and roofs and interior features that would have deteriorated to nothing in almost any other environment. The most famous of the Mesa Verde cliff dwellings, Cliff Palace, contains approximately 150 rooms and 23 kivas, the circular subterranean ceremonial chambers that are a diagnostic feature of ancestral Puebloan sites. It is the largest cliff dwelling in North America. Cliff Palace was occupied for roughly 100 years, from approximately 1190 to 1300 CE. This is not a long time for a major settlement. A century of intense construction, occupation, and then abandonment. The question of why a community would invest the extraordinary labor required to build Cliff Palace in its dramatic, inconvenient, defensively superior location, and then leave after only a century, is one that the official narrative handles with the drought explanation and leaves it there. But the physical evidence at Mesa Verde tells a more complicated story. The construction sequence at Cliff Palace shows multiple phases of modification that are not consistent with a single planned building program. Doorways were blocked. New walls were built across existing passages. The circulation patterns of the building were repeatedly altered in ways that suggest the community was, over time, making specific defensive modifications rather than simple residential additions. The final phase of occupation shows the most extreme defensive modifications: doorways reduced to the smallest possible openings, approaches to the building made as difficult as possible, ground floor access essentially eliminated. And then there is the evidence from the excavation of the midden, the trash deposit, outside the main inhabited portions of Cliff Palace. The midden's upper layers, corresponding to the final decades of occupation, show a dietary pattern significantly different from the earlier occupation layers. The presence of large game bones, which is normally associated with periods of food stress when communities were forced to exploit resources they did not usually prioritize, increases. The presence of domesticated turkey bones, usually a sign of prosperity and surplus, decreases. The ratio of wild to domesticated food resources shifts in ways that are consistent with increasing food insecurity in the final years of occupation. This is not a community that decided leisurely to migrate south because the climate was a bit dry and they had heard the valleys to the south were more pleasant. This is a community under stress, dietary stress, and the defensive modifications suggest the stress of threat or perceived threat of violence that eventually reached a tipping point at which staying was no longer viable. What made staying no longer viable? The drought certainly contributed, but the demographic evidence from across the entire Four Corners region in the late 13th century suggests something more specific. The regional population was in rapid decline. Communities were being abandoned across a wide area in a relatively short time span. And the nature of the abandonment, with its unburied dead, its burned structures, its hasty departures evidenced by personal possessions left in place, is not consistent with an orderly, planned relocation. It is consistent with a crisis, sudden, catastrophic, and widespread enough to end organized community life across tens of thousands of square miles within a few decades. The Numic expansion hypothesis is one of the more interesting and more controversial explanations that researchers have proposed. The Numic peoples, who include the modern Shoshone, Comanche, and Ute, speak languages in the Numic branch of the Uto-Aztecan family. Linguistic analysis of the Numic languages suggests a remarkably rapid spread. From a point of origin in the western Great Basin, probably in what is now eastern California or western Nevada, eastward and northward across a vast territory. The timing of this linguistic expansion, as reconstructed from comparative linguistic analysis, corresponds roughly with the collapse of the ancestral Puebloan communities in the Four Corners region. The hypothesis is that the expansion of Numic-speaking groups into territories previously occupied by ancestral Puebloan communities played a significant role in the destabilization and eventual abandonment of those communities. This is not universally accepted. Some researchers argue that the linguistic expansion could have occurred through mechanisms other than population displacement, through trade, through gradual intermarriage and language shift, without requiring violent conflict. But the archaeological evidence of violence in the final occupation phases of many cliff-dwelling sites is difficult to reconcile with a purely peaceful linguistic expansion, and the correspondence between the timing of the linguistic spread and the timing of the regional abandonment is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The textbook does not mention the Numic expansion hypothesis at all. The textbook does not mention the evidence of violence in the abandonment layers of the cliff-dwelling sites. The textbook says drought, orderly migration, modern Pueblo peoples, and then it moves on to Columbus. This selective presentation is not neutral. It is a choice with consequences. Those consequences include a distorted understanding of the complexity and the tragedy of what actually happened in the pre-Columbian Southwest. They include a missed opportunity to grapple with questions about social collapse, about the relationship between environmental stress and social violence, about the ways that complex, Sophisticated civilizations can unravel surprisingly quickly under sufficient pressure, questions that are not merely historical curiosities but are directly relevant to the present moment in which we live. But there is something even deeper here, something that the selective presentation of the Cliff City story participates in without explicitly stating, something about who gets to have a history and whose history gets to be complicated. The history of American archaeology is, in significant ways, a history of institutional power being used to control the narrative of the American past. This is not a conspiratorial claim. It is a historical observation documented in considerable detail by historians of science who have spent decades examining the institutional structures that shaped how knowledge about the pre-Columbian past was produced, validated, disseminated, and sometimes suppressed. The Smithsonian Institution, which is arguably the most important single institution in the history of American archaeology, has a complicated and at times genuinely troubling relationship with the evidence of ancient America. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Bureau of American Ethnology, a division of the Smithsonian, conducted or sponsored much of the significant archaeological work in North America. And the interpretive frameworks that the Bureau used were shaped, inevitably, by the ideological assumptions of their era. One of those assumptions was that the original inhabitants of the Americas were necessarily, and by definition, less sophisticated, less intelligent, and less culturally complex than European civilization. This assumption served obvious ideological functions in a country that was built on the dispossession of indigenous populations and that needed to justify that dispossession as something other than theft and murder. If the people who were dispossessed had not built anything worth keeping, if they had not achieved civilization in any meaningful sense, then their dispossession was less morally troubling. This ideological pressure manifested in specific research choices. Evidence of complex social organization among pre-Columbian Americans tended to be interpreted in the most minimizing way possible. Evidence of long-distance trade and cultural interaction tended to be attributed to diffusion from more advanced civilizations elsewhere rather than to indigenous development. Evidence of mathematics, astronomy, architecture, engineering, and social complexity tended to be described in ways that acknowledged the facts while framing them in terms that preserved the narrative of fundamental primitiveness. John Wesley Powell, who directed the Bureau of American Ethnology from its founding in 1879 until his death in 1902, was in many ways a genuine champion of indigenous cultures and an opponent of the most extreme forms of racial hierarchy that dominated his era. And yet even Powell operated within a theoretical framework that placed all human cultures on an evolutionary spectrum from savage to barbarous to civilized, with civilized meaning something that looked like European society, and that positioned the most sophisticated pre-Columbian American cultures somewhere in the middle or lower reaches of that spectrum. Within this framework, the cliff dwellings of the Southwest could be acknowledged as impressive, as evidence of a people of considerable ingenuity and industry, while still being positioned as fundamentally less advanced than, fundamentally different from, fundamentally not equivalent to, the civilizations of the Old World that European American culture defined itself against and in relation to. The cliff cities were wonderful, but they were not a civilization. They were a culture, and culture was a lesser category. This framework is still, more than a century later, shaping the presentation of Southwestern prehistory to the public. Not in its most explicit and crudest form. Modern public archaeology has largely abandoned the overt hierarchy of cultures from savage to civilized, but in subtler ways, the legacy of that framework persists. The cliff dwellings are still presented, most commonly, as the cultural achievement of people in the process of becoming more complex, rather than as the achievement of a civilization that had already arrived at significant complexity. The abandonment of the cliff cities is still presented as a story about environmental pressure, rather than as a story about the catastrophic collapse of a complex social system. The violence in the archaeological record is still systematically underemphasized in the public-facing narrative, and there is another dimension to this story that needs to be addressed directly, because it involves something even more uncomfortable than violence. It involves the systematic destruction, distortion, and concealment of archaeological evidence by the very institutions that were supposed to be protecting it. The history of the early excavation of southwestern sites is, in many cases, a history of looting conducted under the name of science. The great houses of Chaco Canyon were excavated, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, by expeditions that removed enormous quantities of material from the sites without maintaining the stratigraphic records that would have made the material scientifically useful, without adequate documentation of context, and in some cases by methods that were more destructive than they were instructive. The Wetherill family, who were among the first non-native people to enter and explore many of the Mesa Verde cliff dwellings in the 1880s, had a genuinely complicated relationship with the sites they found. Richard Wetherill was in many ways a careful and thoughtful observer who recognized the significance of what he was seeing and who worked to document and preserve as much as he could. But he also sold artifacts from the sites, sometimes in quantity, to collectors and museums, and his excavations, however careful by the standards of his time, would be considered deeply destructive by modern standards. The collections that left the Southwest in the late 19th and early 20th centuries are scattered across museums around the world, in conditions that range from excellent to appalling, with documentation that ranges from detailed to essentially non-existent. Objects removed from specific archaeological contexts that would have been interpretable had they been left in place or documented properly are now isolated artifacts whose information content has been largely lost. Pottery, jewelry, textile fragments, wooden objects, ceremonial items, human remains, all of it moved, separated from its context, and in many cases from its community. This is not just an ethical failure, it is a scientific failure. The loss of contextual information from early excavations of southwestern sites has made it permanently impossible to answer certain questions that those sites could otherwise have answered. We will never know what those objects meant, who owned them, how they were used, what their relationship was to other objects found in the same rooms, precisely because they were removed before the development of the contextual recording methods that make such questions answerable. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 was intended to begin addressing the legacy of this history, to create a legal framework for the return of indigenous human remains and sacred objects from museum collections to the communities from which they came. NAGPRA has had genuine achievements. Thousands of sets of human remains and thousands of sacred objects have been repatriated. Relationships between academic institutions and Native American communities have been rebuilt in some cases on more equitable terms. But NAGPRA has also created new complications and new tensions in the archaeology of the Southwest. The repatriation process requires determining affiliation. Which groups have a cultural affiliation with which remains and objects? For materials from the distant past, from the cliff-dwelling era and earlier, affiliation is often genuinely uncertain and contested. Multiple modern groups may have legitimate claims to the same ancient materials. The act of determining affiliation necessarily involves making claims about cultural continuity and ancestral relationships that are sometimes at odds with the archaeological evidence of population movement, cultural change, and the complex mixing of peoples and traditions that the deep time evidence reveals. And in some cases, the repatriation process has resulted in the reburial of remains that could have yielded, and in some cases had already begun to yield, significant scientific information. The Kennewick Man case was the most high-profile example of this tension, but it is not unique. Throughout the Southwest, the question of who has the right to determine what happens to ancient remains, the scientists who study them or the communities that claim them as ancestors, remains genuinely contested and genuinely unresolved, and the resolution of that contest has real consequences for what we will and will not eventually know about the deep human past of the Americas. This is one of the most difficult and most important questions in contemporary American archaeology. It does not have a clean answer. The history of scientific exploitation of indigenous remains and sites is real, and its harms were real. The importance of scientific knowledge about human prehistory is also real, and the potential losses from reburial without study are also real. Living with this tension, navigating it with care and respect and honesty in both directions, is the hard work that the discipline of American archaeology is still learning how to do. The textbook does not mention any of this. The textbook does not tell students that the information in the textbook is the result of a long, complicated, politically fraught process of knowledge production that has at every stage been shaped by power relations, institutional interests, ideological assumptions, and the basic human tendency to see what we expect to see and ignore what we do not. The textbook presents the story of the cliff cities as settled science, as known facts, as the established consensus of a neutral, objective discipline pursuing truth through the rigorous application of the scientific method. And it is true that archaeology is a science, that it uses rigorous methods, that it produces genuine knowledge, but it is a science practiced by human beings within human institutions in a specific historical and political context. And pretending otherwise, presenting the findings of archaeology as something other than the contested, revised, politically inflected, institutionally shaped product that they actually are, is itself a form of deception. Now let us go to the places that are almost never discussed in mainstream accounts of the ancestral Puebloan world. Let us go to the edges, the liminal zones, the sites that do not fit the comfortable story and therefore tend not to appear in it. There is a site in the mountains of what is now southern Colorado, at an elevation of nearly 10,000 feet, where ruins extend along a ridgeline for more than a mile. The site is not accessible by road. Getting to it requires a full day's hike through terrain that is seriously challenging in the best conditions and genuinely dangerous in bad weather. Almost no tourists visit it. It does not appear in the visitor center exhibits at Mesa Verde or Chaco. It barely appears in the published archaeological literature because it has never been systematically excavated. What the few researchers who have visited it describe is a settlement of scale and complexity that does not fit the prevailing understanding of the habitation patterns in that area at that altitude. The site appears to have been occupied over an extended period, with multiple construction phases visible in the standing architecture. The location, at high elevation, far from the canyon bottom agricultural zones that are usually identified as the economic base of ancestral Puebloan communities, raises questions about why a community of that apparent size would be located where it is and how it fed itself. The most obvious answer is defense. The ridge location offers a panoramic view of the surrounding landscape in multiple directions. An approach to the site would be visible from the site itself at distances of miles in good weather. The elevation, while a serious practical disadvantage for agriculture, is an extraordinary strategic advantage for a community that needed above all else to see what was coming. This site is not unique. Across the Four Corners region, there are dozens, possibly hundreds of high-elevation, defensively positioned sites of significant scale that have never been systematically studied, that are not in the published literature in any comprehensive way, that are not in the public consciousness because they have never been included in the narrative that the visiting public encounters. Some of these sites are on federal land, theoretically protected but practically inaccessible and unmonitored. Some are on private land, with uncertain legal protections and uncertain futures. Some are known to local communities, native and non-native, but not to the academic discipline that officially studies them. The archaeology of the American Southwest is not complete. It is not even close to complete. The sites that have been systematically studied, the sites that appear in the textbooks and the visitor center exhibits and the peer-reviewed journals, are a fraction, perhaps a small fraction, of the sites that exist and that could, if studied, yield significant information about the people who lived here. The story we have is not the whole story. It is the story of the sites that happen to be accessible, that happen to attract researchers, that happen to survive not just the centuries of abandonment, but the decades of academic neglect and institutional inertia, and in some cases, deliberate destruction. What else is out there? What other great houses? What other road networks? What other astronomical alignments, what other evidence of social complexity and long-distance connection and sophisticated knowledge of the landscape are waiting in the canyons and on the mesa tops and in the mountain valleys of the Southwest, unexcavated, unstudied, uncatalogued, invisible to the narrative we have constructed? The honest answer is that we do not know, and the honest response to not knowing should be humility, should be the recognition that the story we tell is provisional, incomplete, and almost certainly wrong in important ways that we have not yet identified. Instead, what the textbook offers is false confidence, the presentation of a simplified, sanitized, ideologically convenient version of events, as if it were settled fact. Let us talk now about something that is hiding in plain sight in the archaeological record of the Southwest, something that the standard interpretation has struggled to explain adequately, and that points toward a level of organizational sophistication in ancestral Puebloan society that is genuinely difficult to reconcile with the textbook's characterization of these communities as simple agricultural villages. The timber problem at Chaco Canyon. Pueblo Bonito and the other great houses at Chaco Canyon required, during their construction, a minimum of 200,000 wooden beams for roofing and structural support. The canyon itself and the immediately surrounding landscape had, by the time of the great house construction peak, been largely deforested by centuries of fuel use and construction. The nearest stands of timber, large enough to produce beams of the size needed, were in mountain ranges many miles distant. The nearest such forest in the most likely direction was the Chusca Mountains, approximately 50 miles west of Chaco Canyon. The beams that roofed the great houses came from there. Analysis of the wood, using tree ring dendrochronology combined with trace element analysis and other techniques, has confirmed that timber from the Chuscas was transported to Chaco Canyon over a period of centuries in enormous quantities. 200,000 beams, each one several feet long and heavy, each one requiring to be cut, trimmed, transported, and placed into the building. Without wheeled vehicles, without draft animals that could pull carts, on human backs, over 50 miles of high desert terrain, this is an extraordinary logistical accomplishment. It required the organized, sustained, coordinated effort of large numbers of people over a long period. It required something like an institutional authority that could direct that effort, that could call on labor from communities across the regional network, that could organize the cutting crews and the transport parties and the construction teams, and keep all of them working toward the same goal over decades. It required, in other words, something that looks very much like the administrative capacity of a state-level society, even if it did not have the specific forms, the written records, the territorial bureaucracy, the standing army that we usually associate with states. The textbook does not engage with this. The textbook says the Chacoans built impressive buildings and does not follow the logical implications of what building those buildings would have required. The textbook does not ask how a small-scale, decentralized agricultural society managed to coordinate the largest construction program in the pre-Columbian Southwest across 200 years. The textbook does not ask because asking the question would require acknowledging that the answer points toward a level of social complexity that does not fit the comfortable primitive agricultural community framework. There is one more dimension of the Cliff City story that we have not yet addressed, and it is in some ways the most interesting and the most mysterious of all. It concerns what the cliff dwellers knew about the sky. The astronomical knowledge embedded in the architecture and landscape of the ancestral Puebloan world is one of the most remarkable and most underappreciated aspects of their civilization. The Chaco Canyon alignments are the most famous and the most extensively documented, but they are by no means unique. Across the Four Corners region, at site after site, researchers who have looked carefully at the orientation of structures, the placement of petroglyphs, the positioning of windows and doorways, have found deliberate astronomical encoding that testifies to a level of systematic observation and mathematical knowledge that the textbook narrative simply does not accommodate. The Chaco Sun Dagger, discovered in 1977 by artist and researcher Anna Sofer, is perhaps the most visually dramatic example. On a rocky outcrop called Fajada Butte at the southern entrance to Chaco Canyon, 3 large stone slabs leaning against the cliff face create a pattern of light and shadow on a spiral petroglyph behind them. On the summer solstice, at solar noon, a single dagger of light bisects the center of the larger spiral precisely. On the winter solstice, 2 daggers of light frame the edges of the same spiral. At the equinoxes, a dagger of light bisects a smaller spiral to the side. The encoding is so precise that it could only function if the stone slabs had been placed deliberately, at the correct distances from the cliff face and at the correct angles, to create these specific light patterns at those specific astronomical moments. The amount of observational work required to design this system is significant. You would need to observe the position of the solar noon shadow across the cliff face at multiple points throughout the year, recording both the shape of the light pattern and the astronomical timing. You would need to calculate or derive, through repeated observation, the precise placement that would produce the desired patterns. You would need to then position the stone slabs with the required precision, which would have required multiple adjustment sessions to get the calibration right. This is not casual astronomical observation. This is systematic, methodical, mathematically informed scientific work. The Chaco Sun Dagger is not a unique instance. At the massive Great House of Casa Rinconada, the largest great kiva in the Chacoan system, a window in the northeast wall is positioned so that on the summer solstice at sunrise, a shaft of light enters the kiva and illuminates an unusual niche in the opposite wall. The alignment is too precise to be accidental. This is a building in which a specific interior event, the illumination of a specific feature, was designed to occur on a specific astronomical date. The architects who designed Casa Rinconada were working with a level of astronomical knowledge and a level of construction precision that allowed them to encode this event into the building before it was built, which means they knew in advance where the sunrise would be on the summer solstice and could calculate the precise window orientation needed to project the light onto the target. What does it mean to know these things? What does it mean to have the astronomical knowledge and the mathematical sophistication and the architectural precision to encode astronomical events into your buildings deliberately? It means that the people who built these structures were, by any reasonable definition, scientists. Not scientists in the modern institutional sense, not scientists with laboratories and peer-reviewed publications and university departments, but scientists in the deeper sense, systematic observers of natural phenomena, developers of models to explain and predict those phenomena, practitioners of an empirical discipline transmitted through systematic education and applied to practical problems with considerable sophistication. The modern Pueblo peoples have oral traditions about their ancestors' astronomical knowledge that are consistent with this interpretation. The knowledge of the movements of the sun and moon and specific stars was of enormous practical importance to agricultural communities because it governed the timing of planting, of harvest, of the ceremonial cycle that organized communal life. The specialists who maintained and transmitted this knowledge held positions of considerable authority and importance in their communities. And the buildings that encoded and expressed this knowledge, like the great kivas of Chaco, were not incidental to the community's life, but were its central organizing institutions. Here is another dimension of the astronomical sophistication of the ancestral Puebloans that rarely appears in the standard narrative. There is growing evidence that the Chacoan road system, particularly the Great North Road, was not just a practical route or a ceremonial axis, but was itself an astronomical instrument, oriented to celestial phenomena in ways that went beyond simple cardinal direction alignment. The Great North Road, as mentioned earlier, runs nearly perfectly north from Chaco Canyon. True north, not magnetic north, a distinction that matters because magnetic north varies with time and location and requires specific knowledge to correct for. The road was oriented to true north, the direction of the celestial pole around which all other stars appear to rotate. In many traditions, the celestial pole, the point in the sky that does not move, holds profound cosmological significance as the axis of the world, the pivot around which the universe turns, the direction from which the fundamental ordering principle of reality operates. Building a 30-mile road oriented to true north, in a landscape where the terrain constantly varies and where maintaining a straight line requires specific surveying methods, was not a simple task. It required the ability to determine true north with precision and to maintain that orientation across distance. How did the Chacoans do this? The most obvious answer is stellar observation, the ability to identify the celestial pole through observation of the rotation of circumpolar stars and to project that direction onto the landscape. But doing this with the precision required to build a road that remains within the margin of error observable in the Great North Road requires sustained, careful observation and the ability to communicate that observation into a practical surveying procedure. There is another remarkable and little discussed feature of the Chacoan astronomical system, the apparent tracking of the lunar standstill cycle. The moon's rising and setting positions on the horizon are not fixed. They vary in an 18.6-year cycle, moving from a northern maximum to a southern maximum and back. At the maximum positions, the lunar standstill, the moon rises and sets at its most extreme northern or southern points, and the full moon's arc across the sky is at its most dramatic. Analysis of the orientations of specific Chacoan great houses has suggested that some of them are aligned not to solar events, not to cardinal directions, but to the lunar standstill. If this interpretation is correct, it means that the Chacoans were tracking an astronomical cycle of nearly 19 years, which requires the kind of systematic, generation-spanning astronomical observation that can only be maintained within an institutional framework, an institution that persists across individual human lifetimes and maintains records or oral traditions precise enough to allow comparison of observations separated by 2 decades. This is civilization-level astronomical knowledge. This is the kind of knowledge that, in the Old World, we associate with Babylon and Egypt and medieval Islamic scholarship. And it was being practiced, apparently, in the canyon country of the American Southwest nearly 1,000 years ago, by a people whose civilization the standard narrative characterizes as a simple agricultural village culture. Why does the standard narrative fail to engage seriously with this? Partly it is the technical complexity. Astronomical archaeology is a specialized field that requires knowledge of both archaeology and astronomy and is therefore difficult to present in accessible terms to a general audience. Partly it is the institutional resistance of mainstream archaeology to claims that, if accepted, would require a significant revision of the prevailing picture of pre-Columbian cultural complexity. And partly it is the ideological residue of the primitive versus civilized framework. If you have already decided that these people were not a civilization, you will tend to find alternative explanations for the evidence rather than allowing the evidence to challenge your decision. But there is also something more specific, more recent, and more troubling at work. In 2000, the National Park Service took an action at Fajardo Butte that has been a source of ongoing controversy among southwestern researchers. In an attempt to prevent further deterioration of the site from visitor impact, access to Fajardo Butte was restricted to the point of effective closure. The Sun Dagger site, which Anna Sofair had been studying and documenting for more than 2 decades, became essentially inaccessible for ongoing research. The official rationale was preservation, and there is no doubt that the butte and its petroglyphs had suffered measurable damage from the thousands of visitors who climbed it after the Sun Dagger's public discovery. But the effect of the closure was to halt systematic scientific observation of a site whose astronomical significance was still being actively investigated. Questions about whether other alignments existed at the site, whether the encoding was more complex than the known 3 events, whether there were relationships between the Fajardo Butte astronomical markers and other features of the canyon, could no longer be explored through direct observation. The site was preserved, in the sense that it was protected from further damage. But the knowledge it contained was also preserved, in the sense of being locked away, inaccessible to the ongoing process of scientific investigation that could have continued to reveal its secrets. This is not a conspiracy. The Park Service's decision reflected a genuine conflict between preservation values and research access, that is a permanent feature of managing important archaeological sites. But the outcome of that decision is that one of the most important astronomical sites in North America is now, essentially, in a state of enforced mystery, its further interpretation foreclosed by the institutional decision to prioritize protection over understanding. Let us now turn to what may be the most significant and most systematically ignored discovery in the history of southwestern archaeology. Let us talk about the evidence for pre-Columbian contact between the peoples of the American Southwest and the complex civilizations of Mesoamerica, and what that evidence implies about the nature and the scale of the civilization that built the cliff cities. The presence of macaws at Chaco Canyon is not a minor curiosity. It is a major piece of evidence. Scarlet macaws are native to tropical lowland forests in southern Mexico and Central America. They are not migratory birds that might occasionally wander north. Getting a live macaw from its natural habitat to Chaco Canyon required capturing it, transporting it alive over a distance of approximately 1,200 miles through increasingly arid and alien terrain, and maintaining it in captivity in an environment completely unlike its natural range. The effort required to do this, even once, is significant. The evidence at Chaco Canyon and at related sites is not for a single macaw or a handful of macaws. Researchers have documented the remains of hundreds of scarlet macaws at Chacoan sites, along with dedicated macaw-raising facilities, specialized rooms that were apparently designed and maintained as aviaries, and the skeletal evidence of birds that spent their entire lives in captivity. This is not evidence of rare or occasional exotic trade. This is evidence of a sustained, organized, ongoing exchange relationship with the tropical cultures of Mexico. And it is not just macaws. At the Great House of Pueblo Bonito, researchers have found copper bells, dozens of copper bells, that are technologically identical to copper bells produced in the workshops of West Mexican cultures, particularly the Hohokam in Arizona, and their trading partners further south. Copper bells are not items that could be independently invented and independently manufactured at two separate locations and come out looking identical. They are produced by a specific lost wax casting technique that was developed at a specific time and place in Mesoamerica and that spread through trade and direct contact. The presence of these bells at Pueblo Bonito means that someone carried them there, or someone at Pueblo Bonito had access to a supplier who could provide them. It means there was a supply chain reaching from the copper-working workshops of West Mexico to the high desert of northwestern New Mexico. It means the Chacoans were not the isolated, inward-looking desert community the standard narrative sometimes implies, but were participants in a long-distance exchange system that connected them to the most complex and sophisticated civilizations in the Western Hemisphere. And the influence ran both ways. Architectural analysis of Chacoan great houses has identified specific features that have been compared to the architectural forms of Mesoamerican ceremonial centers. The use of elevated, multi-story platforms to create vertical height in otherwise horizontal landscapes. The organization of space around a central open area. The integration of subterranean chambers, the kivas, into otherwise surface-level structures. These are not features that appear independently in the Chacoan tradition without any precedent. They appear in the Chacoan tradition at roughly the same time that the Chacoan system's connections to Mesoamerican exchange networks were intensifying. Were the architects of Pueblo Bonito and Casa Rinconada directly inspired by what they knew of Mesoamerican architectural traditions? Did Chacoan elites visit Mesoamerican ceremonial centers, or did they receive visits from Mesoamerican merchants and dignitaries who brought architectural ideas along with copper bells and macaw eggs? We do not know. The evidence is not definitive, but it is suggestive, and it is suggestive in a direction that the standard narrative has been reluctant to follow. The reluctance has a name. It is called the hyperdiffusionist fallacy, and it haunts American archaeology like a ghost that will not stay buried. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, theorists known as hyperdiffusionists argued that every instance of cultural sophistication in the pre-Columbian Americas could be explained as the result of contact with and diffusion from Old World civilizations primarily Egypt or ancient Near Eastern cultures. These theorists denied the capacity of indigenous American peoples for independent cultural development and attributed every impressive achievement of pre-Columbian civilization to external influence. The hyperdiffusionist theories were wrong, were thoroughly refuted by mainstream archaeology, and were clearly motivated in significant part by the same ideological assumptions about the inherent incapacity of non-European peoples for independent cultural development that shaped the worst of the colonial enterprise. The refutation of hyperdiffusionism was correct and necessary, but the overcorrection to hyperdiffusionism created its own problems. In the effort to demonstrate that pre-Columbian American civilizations were genuinely independent and not derived from Old World influence, mainstream archaeology developed a strong reflexive suspicion of any claim that suggested significant contact or influence between culturally distinct regional systems. Within the Americas, the tendency was to treat each regional culture as essentially independent, developing in isolation, with diffusion and contact acknowledged only when the evidence was overwhelming and unavoidable. The evidence for sustained, organized contact between the Chacoan system and Mesoamerican cultures has been overwhelming and unavoidable for decades. The macaws, the copper bells, the architectural parallels, the ceramic traditions, the presence of Mesoamerican-derived ritual practices at Chacoan sites. All of it points toward a relationship of real depth and duration. But the standard narrative has handled this evidence by acknowledging it minimally and then not following its implications. Because the implications are significant, if the Chacoans were in sustained contact with Mesoamerican civilizations, they were in contact with peoples who had developed writing systems, mathematical calendars of extraordinary precision, monumental architecture on a scale that dwarfs even the great houses of Chaco, sophisticated astronomical knowledge, complex political systems, large-scale warfare, long-distance trade networks of continental scope, and a ritual religious tradition of enormous complexity. The knowledge that would have been available through sustained engagement with these civilizations would have been available to the Chacoans. Did the Chacoans have something like a calendar system? The astronomical evidence suggests they were tracking events of a complexity that would have required systematic calendrical notation. Did they have a writing system, or something like one? No unambiguous evidence of writing has been identified at Chacoan sites, but the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly given the organic materials that would have served as writing surfaces and that rarely survive in the archaeological record. These are questions that the standard narrative has not seriously pursued because pursuing them would require acknowledging a level of cultural sophistication and a depth of regional connection that does not fit the framework within which the story of the cliff cities has been told. The story the textbook tells is a story of simple people in a hard land who built impressively within their limits and then, when the land failed them, moved on. It is a story without tragedy, without complexity, without the moral weight that the actual evidence demands. It is a story designed to be told in 20 minutes at a visitor center before the family moves on to the gift shop. The real story is different. The real story is one of a civilization of genuine sophistication, genuine achievement, and genuine tragedy. A civilization that built astronomical observatories into its great houses and encoded the movements of the sun and moon and stars into the landscape itself. A civilization that coordinated the labor of tens of thousands of people across a region of 25,000 square miles to build a ceremonial center of extraordinary ambition and to maintain it for 300 years. A civilization that was connected, through sustained trade and contact, to the most sophisticated cultures in the Western Hemisphere. And a civilization that, in the late 13th century, collapsed with a speed and completeness that left its great houses empty and its road network abandoned and its astronomical markers unwatched for 7 centuries, until a handful of curious researchers began to notice what the stones had been trying to say all along. What happened to these people? Where did they go? And why, when they left, did they leave so much behind? The descendants of the cliff dwellers did not vanish. This is one of the most important facts that the textbook version handles most clumsily. The modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, including the Hopi, the Zuni, the various Rio Grande Pueblo communities, the people of Acoma, of Laguna, of Isleta, of Taos, of dozens of other communities that are still there, still occupied, still maintaining living cultural traditions that stretch back directly to the people who built the cliff cities, are the evidence that the story did not simply end. The ancestors of the modern Pueblo peoples did not disappear. They moved, they consolidated, they reorganized, and they survived through the abandonment of the cliff cities and through the centuries of subsequent history that brought Spanish colonization, forced conversion, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, Reconquest, the American annexation of the Southwest, the reservation system, the boarding school era, the systematic attempts of the American state to destroy indigenous language and culture, and everything else that the subsequent centuries inflicted on them. They are still here. But the relationship between the people who left the cliff cities and the people who are here now is more complex than the standard narrative acknowledges. The movement from the Four Corners region to the Rio Grande Valley and to the Hopi Mesas and to Zuni in the late 13th and early 14th centuries was not a simple relocation of intact communities to new locations. It was a period of profound social reorganization in which communities that had maintained distinct identities for generations mixed and merged and reformed in new configurations. People from different traditions, with different ritual practices, different pottery styles, different architectural conventions, came together in the new communities that emerged in the south and east. The modern Pueblo communities are, in a very real sense, the synthesis products of a period of intense social mixing, in which the people who survived the collapse of the Four Corners civilization were reorganizing themselves around new identities, new institutions, new ways of being communities in a landscape that had not previously been their specific homeland. This does not diminish the continuity between the cliff dwellers and the modern Pueblo peoples, but it complicates the direct, linear narrative of ancestry that is sometimes presented, and it points toward the social complexity and flexibility of the people involved, their capacity to rebuild and reorganize and create new cultural forms under pressure as one of the most remarkable and most underappreciated aspects of the entire story. The Hopi, in particular, maintain oral traditions about their ancestors' migrations that are remarkably consistent with the archaeological evidence of population, movement, and social reorganization in the late 13th and 14th centuries. The Hopi concept of the Pahana, the migration, describes a period when the clans were scattered and traveled widely across the landscape, fulfilling ceremonial obligations and gathering knowledge before converging on the Hopi mesas to form the communities that are there today. The specific migration routes that different Hopi clans trace in their oral traditions correspond, in many cases, with the distribution of ancestral Puebloan sites in the region, as if the oral tradition has preserved, across 7 centuries, a geographic memory of the migration that the archaeology is independently confirming. This correspondence between oral tradition and archaeological evidence is one of the most compelling and most underused resources in southwestern archaeology. For most of the 20th century, the attitude of mainstream archaeology toward indigenous oral traditions was dismissive. Oral traditions were interesting as cultural artifacts, but they were not reliable historical sources because they were transmitted across generations in forms that were subject to change and embellishment, and that lacked the verifiability that documentary or physical evidence provided. This dismissiveness was partly methodological, partly ideological, and partly the product of a specific historical moment in which the discipline of archaeology was working to establish itself as a science, and therefore was working to distance itself from the humanistic traditions that oral transmission represents. In recent decades, the attitude has shifted significantly, driven partly by the political imperative to engage more respectfully with indigenous knowledge systems, and partly by specific cases in which oral traditions proved to be more accurate historical records than the skeptics had assumed. The most dramatic such case is not from the southwest, but from the Pacific Northwest. In 1700, a massive earthquake ruptured a 1,200-mile segment of the Cascadia subduction zone off the Pacific coast of North America, generating a tsunami that devastated coastal communities and sent a wave across the Pacific that was recorded in Japanese historical sources. The geological evidence of this earthquake and tsunami was identified by researchers in the 1980s and 1990s, and when researchers subsequently examined the oral traditions of Pacific Northwest Coast indigenous peoples, they found detailed, consistent accounts of a catastrophic event described in mythological terms, but with geographic and phenomenological details that match the geological record closely enough to be unmistakable. An oral tradition had preserved the memory of a specific geological event for 300 years across multiple generations in a form that was accurate enough to be corroborated by independent physical evidence. This is not an isolated case. Similar correspondences between oral tradition and geological or archaeological evidence have been documented in multiple indigenous traditions. The implications for how we use oral traditions as historical sources are significant. Applied to the Southwest, this means that the oral traditions of the Hopi and the other Pueblo peoples about the migration period are not just culturally interesting stories. They are potentially historical documents that, interpreted carefully and in dialogue with the archaeological evidence, may be able to tell us things about the late 13th century that the archaeology alone cannot. What do those traditions say? They say, among other things, that the migration was not primarily a response to environmental failure. They say that the clans moved because they were fulfilling obligations, following ceremonial imperatives that required them to occupy and bless and eventually depart from specific places in the landscape before converging at their final destination. They say that the organization of the migration was not chaotic flight, but purposeful movement directed by spiritual knowledge and by the authority of those who maintained that knowledge. This is a radically different interpretive framework from the environmental pressure, survival-driven migration story that the textbook offers. And it is not incompatible with the archaeological evidence of environmental stress and social violence in the final years of the Cliff City occupation. In Hopi cosmological thinking, the physical and the spiritual are not separate categories. A period of environmental failure and social violence could be simultaneously a period of spiritual crisis requiring ceremonial response, and the response, the migration, could be simultaneously a survival strategy and a spiritual obligation. This is the kind of interpretive complexity that the textbook narrative is not equipped to handle, because the textbook narrative operates in a framework that treats the physical and the spiritual as separate categories, and that privileges the physical explanation as the real one. The Hopi are not offering an alternative to the environmental explanation. They are offering a more complex framework in which the environmental, the social, and the spiritual are all aspects of a single process that requires all three levels of interpretation to be understood. There is something profound in this that goes beyond the specific history of the Cliff City abandonment. The civilization that built the Cliff Cities existed in a conceptual universe that was different from the one that modern Western scholarship operates in, not just in its specific beliefs and practices, but in its fundamental assumptions about the relationship between human beings and the natural world, between the material and the spiritual, between the individual and the community, between the living and the dead, between the present moment and the long sweep of ancestral time, understanding that civilization requires not just archaeology, not just the physical evidence of stones and bones and pottery, but a willingness to engage seriously with the intellectual traditions that animated it and that survive in modified but recognizable form in the living cultures of the modern Pueblo peoples. It requires treating indigenous knowledge systems not as charming supplements to the real scientific story, but as independent, and in some respects, more comprehensive frameworks for understanding what happened in those canyons. This is the final lie of the textbook version, and it is in some ways the most fundamental one. The textbook treats the Cliff Cities as a finished story, as a chapter in a history that ended, as the ruins of something that is no longer alive. The reality is that the civilization of the Cliff City builders did not die. It transformed. It survived. It is still here, embodied in the living communities, the living languages, the living ceremonial traditions, the living knowledge systems of the modern Pueblo peoples. The cliff cities are not monuments to a vanished civilization. They are monuments to a civilization that is still living, that is still carrying the knowledge of what happened in those canyons, that is still performing the ceremonies that their ancestors performed in those kivas, that is still watching the sky and marking the solstices and maintaining the ritual connections to the landscape that were already ancient when Pueblo Bonito was built. This matters because it means that the story of the cliff cities is not a historical puzzle to be solved by archaeologists working from physical evidence alone. It is an ongoing conversation between the ruins and the living communities, between the physical record and the oral traditions, between the institutional knowledge of the academic discipline and the traditional knowledge of the communities whose ancestors made that physical record. And it is a conversation that has not been conducted throughout most of the history of American archaeology on terms that were fair or honest or respectful to both parties. Now let us go deeper still into the specific places, the specific discoveries, the specific pieces of evidence that the standard story either ignores entirely or mentions so briefly and so carefully that their significance is entirely lost. There is a site in the canyon country of Utah, in a region so remote that it was not systematically surveyed by archaeologists until the late 20th century, where an entire complex of structures has been documented that does not fit any of the standard categories of ancestral Puebloan architecture. The buildings are not cliff dwellings, though they use cliff faces for their back walls. They are not great houses in the Chacoan sense, though their masonry is of comparable quality. They are something else, something for which the existing typological framework does not have a good category, and for that reason they have been largely absent from the published literature and from the public narrative. What makes them unusual is their scale, their integration with the landscape, and certain features of their internal organization that suggest a function that is neither primarily residential nor primarily agricultural in focus. The structures are oriented in ways that the researchers who have examined them informally have not been able to explain through either the practical or the astronomical frameworks that usually account for ancestral Puebloan building. Orientation. The stone is worked with a level of precision that exceeds what would be needed for residential or agricultural structures. And in the surrounding landscape, there are features, earthworks, modified rock surfaces, altered drainage channels, that suggest the entire area was organized according to a plan whose purpose is not yet understood. The site has not been systematically excavated. It has not been formally described in the peer-reviewed literature. It is known to a small number of researchers and to local communities, native and non-native, who have their own frameworks for understanding what it is and what it means. And it will remain in this ambiguous status until the funding, the institutional support, and the political will to conduct serious research there converges, which may take decades, may take generations, or may never happen if the site is damaged in the meantime by erosion, by climate change, or by the increasing pressure of human visitation in the canyon country. This is not the only such site. The canyon country of the Colorado Plateau, the vast highland region that includes the Four Corners, is one of the most archaeologically rich environments in North America and one of the least systematically surveyed. The extreme difficulty of access, the lack of roads, the severe weather, the remoteness from academic centers, and the political and jurisdictional complexity of a landscape divided among multiple federal agencies, tribal nations, and private landowners have all conspired to leave huge areas effectively unstudied. Aerial survey in recent decades, including the use of LiDAR technology that can detect subtle topographic features under vegetation and soil, has begun to reveal the scale of what remains unexamined. LiDAR surveys of portions of the canyon country have identified earthworks, modified landscapes, alignments of stones, and other features that are consistent with organized human activity but that have never been the subject of ground investigation. The extent of the organized human activity that has left traces in this landscape traces now visible only from the air with specialized instrumentation, is beginning to suggest a degree of landscape modification across the region that would imply a level of organized effort and long-term planning far beyond what the standard narrative currently attributes to the peoples who lived here. In other regions of the world, LiDAR surveys have produced results that have fundamentally changed archaeologists' understanding of the scale and complexity of pre-modern civilizations. LiDAR surveys of the Maya lowlands in the 2010s revealed a network of cities, roads, and agricultural modifications across millions of acres that indicated a Maya civilization at least 3 times larger than previous estimates had suggested. Similar surveys of the Cambodian lowlands around Angkor have revealed a medieval city larger than modern Paris. The technology is not exotic or experimental. It is available. It has been applied in other regions with transformative results. The systematic application of LiDAR and other remote sensing technologies to the archaeology of the American Southwest is still in its early stages. The results so far are tantalizing. What the full survey will reveal, when it is eventually completed, may require a fundamental revision of every standard assumption about the scale and complexity of pre-Columbian civilization in the region. But that revision will not happen quickly. The institutional inertia of a discipline that has been telling the same story for a century is substantial. The funding structures that support archaeological research are not designed to reward disruptive findings. The political complexities of researching landscapes that are simultaneously the ancestral homelands of living indigenous communities and the jurisdictional territory of multiple governmental agencies create obstacles that can take years to navigate, and the sheer physical difficulty and expense of conducting systematic research in some of the most remote terrain in North America is a real and persistent constraint. So the full story of the cliff cities remains to be told. What we have is a partial story, told from a partial evidence base, shaped by institutional interests and ideological assumptions and political pressures, and presented to the public in a form that is far simpler, far tidier, and far more comfortable than the actual complexity of the evidence demands. What we know for certain is this. The people who built the cliff cities were not simple. They were not primitive. They were not beginning the long climb towards civilization that would only be completed by European contact. They were already there, already at the summit of something, already in possession of knowledge and organizational capacity and cultural sophistication that the textbook narrative has consistently underestimated and systematically misrepresented. We know that they built astronomical instruments into their landscapes and their buildings with a precision that testifies to mathematical and observational knowledge of a high order. We know that they coordinated labor and resources across a regional system of extraordinary scale for 300 years. We know that they were connected to the broader world of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican civilization through sustained, organized trade and cultural exchange. We know that the end of their civilization was violent as well as environmental, catastrophic as well as gradual, and that it left marks in the landscape and in the skeletal record that the standard narrative has chosen not to emphasize. We know that their descendants are still here, still living, still carrying the accumulated knowledge of their ancestors in forms that are living and dynamic rather than fixed and fossilized. And we know that the full conversation between that living knowledge and the physical evidence of the ruins has barely begun. The cliff cities are not finished. They are waiting for the light that falls through specific windows on specific mornings to be noticed and recorded by someone paying careful attention, waiting for the oral traditions of the living communities to be taken seriously as historical sources by researchers willing to engage with them honestly, waiting for the full LiDAR survey, the systematic ground investigation, the decades of patient analysis that will eventually begin to reveal the full scope of what was built here and what it meant. Waiting, above all, for the story to be told in its full complexity, without the sanitizing, the simplifying, the comfortable lies of omission that the textbook version substitutes for the truth. The stone walls are still standing. The plaster still holds the prints of the hands that smoothed it. The windows still frame the sunrise on the solstice mornings with the precision of an instrument built by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and intended for it to be noticed. 700 years have passed, and the astronomical encoding still works, still marks the turning of the year with the same shaft of light falling at the same angle on the same morning. Whatever else we can say about the people who built this, whatever we do not yet know, whatever the full story will eventually reveal, we can say this with confidence. They were paying attention. They were paying a quality of attention to the world around them, to the sky above them, to the land beneath them, to the cycles of time that organize their world that most people in most times and most places have not managed to sustain. They were paying the kind of attention that makes knowledge, the deep, cumulative, intergenerational knowledge that gets built into stone and into road alignments, and into the precise angles of windows, and into the spiral patterns on cliff faces that will catch the noon light on the longest day of the year. That attention is something. It is more than something. It is a kind of achievement that deserves to be honored in its full complexity, not packaged into a 20-minute visitor center experience and sent back out into the parking lot with a refrigerator magnet and a glossy pamphlet. The real story of the cliff cities is still being written, piece by piece, site by site, careful excavation by careful excavation, LiDAR survey by LiDAR survey, conversation by conversation between researchers and the living communities who carry the memory of these places in their language and their ceremony and their continued presence on the land. We are not at the end of this story. We are barely at the beginning of understanding it honestly, and that is, in some ways, the most exciting thing of all, because the cliff cities are waiting to tell us something, and we are only just learning how to listen. There are canyons in the southwest that no archaeologist has yet entered with a trowel. There are alcoves in cliff faces that have never been photographed, never been measured, never been described in any publication. There are oral traditions in living Pueblo communities that have never been shared with outside researchers, that are maintained within ceremonial contexts that are not accessible to academic inquiry, that preserve knowledge about specific places and specific practices and specific historical events that the physical record alone will never yield. The full picture, if it ever comes into focus, will be assembled from all of these sources. The physical evidence of the ruins, the oral traditions of the living communities, the new technologies that reveal buried and invisible landscape features, the patient reanalysis of museum collections with analytical methods that were not available when those collections were assembled, and the ongoing conversation between all of these sources in a spirit of genuine intellectual humility. That picture, when it is assembled, will not look like what the textbook describes. It will be more complex, more sophisticated, more deeply connected to the broader sweep of human cultural development, more shot through with violence and tragedy and extraordinary achievement, more present in the living cultures of the descendants who are still here, still watching the sky, still marking the solstices, still carrying the memory of the cliff cities in their ceremonial traditions and their oral histories, and their identity as people whose ancestors built something extraordinary in the canyon country of North America. That is the real story. It is not finished. It is not settled. It is not safe to package into a glossy pamphlet. But it is true, or at least closer to true, than the version the textbook offers. And it deserves to be told with the honesty and the complexity and the respect that the people who lived it, and the people who are descended from them, and the places that hold the physical record of it, all of them together deserve. The cliff cities are still there. The walls are still standing. The windows are still waiting for the light. And somewhere out in the canyon country, beyond the end of the paved road, beyond the reach of the cell phone signal, beyond the edge of the visitor center's explanatory framework, there is a site that no researcher has yet systematically studied, walls still standing in an alcove that was last occupied by a living human being 700 years ago. And in those walls there are rooms that hold answers to questions we have not yet thought to ask. The story is not over. It has barely begun. And if you have been drifting towards sleep through all of this, through the canyon walls and the astronomical alignments and the road networks and the terrible beauty of the collapse and the stubborn, extraordinary survival of the people who came after, then you have been in very good company. These are the kinds of stories that deserve to accompany us into the dark, into the place where the rational mind relaxes its grip and the deeper parts of us that still know, somehow, what it felt like to watch the sunrise through a carefully oriented window in a stone wall can surface and breathe. The cliff cities are still there. The sun still moves. The stone still holds the prints of the hands that shaped it. And somewhere in the southwest tonight, the stars are moving across the same sky that the people of Chaco Canyon watched 7 centuries ago, following the same paths, marking the same cycles, waiting for someone to notice what they have always been saying. Sleep well. And when you wake, look up. Let us go back to the ruins one more time. Let us walk through them slowly, in the way that they demand to be walked through, which is not the way of the family road trip with the parking lot and the audio tour and the 90-minute window before everyone gets tired and hungry. Let us walk through them in the way of someone who has time, who is willing to sit in one place for an hour and watch the light move across the stone and think about what it meant to live here, to be born here, to die here. Betatakin is one of the largest cliff dwellings in Arizona, located in the Navajo National Monument in the northeastern part of the state. It sits in an alcove that is, by any measure, one of the most beautiful natural shelters in the American Southwest. The alcove is enormous, arching perhaps 500 feet from floor to ceiling at its highest point, curving inward like a cathedral apse, oriented so that the morning sun floods it with golden light, while the harshest afternoon heat is blocked by the overhanging cliff. The people who chose this alcove chose well. They chose with the eye of someone who understood the geometry of light and shadow, the physics of heat retention and heat dispersion, the engineering of natural shelter. The ruins within the alcove contain approximately 130 rooms, organized in a roughly semicircular plan that follows the natural curve of the alcove wall. The construction is of a high standard, the masonry careful, the walls built to specifications that suggest not improvised construction but adherence to established conventions. And like so many cliff dwellings, Betatakin was occupied for a surprisingly short period. The dendrochronological evidence from the roof timbers indicates that construction began around 1267 CE and continued for approximately 10 years. Occupation appears to have ended around 1300 CE, 30 years. Betatakin was built and abandoned in 30 years. The investment of labor required to construct 130 rooms in a cliff alcove, accessible only by a considerable climb from the canyon floor, was substantial. The organizational effort required to move a community into that alcove, to establish the routines of daily life in a space so dramatically different from the canyon-bottom villages where people had previously lived, to maintain the logistical chain that moved water and food up the cliff face on a daily basis, was also substantial. And yet the entire episode lasted 30 years, a single generation. What happened? What happened during those 30 years that caused the people of Betatakin to make the extraordinary effort of building their community in that alcove, and then, barely a generation later, to leave everything behind and depart? The standard answer is drought. But we have already established that drought alone is not sufficient to explain the specific choices involved. Building in a cliff alcove does not help with drought. It makes access to water harder, not easier. The defensive advantage of the alcove location is real. The agricultural advantage is nil. The choice to build at Betatakin was not made by people who were worried primarily about water. Keet Seal, the other major cliff dwelling within the Navajo National Monument, and one of the largest and best preserved cliff dwellings in the Southwest, tells a similar story. Keet Seal was occupied from approximately 1250 to 1300 CE. It contains approximately 160 rooms. It is extraordinary in its state of preservation, with rooms still containing wooden furniture, with bundles of stored corn still in some of the storage spaces, with evidence of daily life so immediate and so vivid that it does not feel like archaeology so much as like walking through a house from which the occupants departed yesterday and to which they intend to return this afternoon. They did not return. The corn in the storage rooms was never eaten. The tools left in the rooms were never recovered. Whatever emergency prompted the departure from Keat-Seal was severe enough that even the most basic, practical consideration, taking your stored food with you, was overridden. You do not leave your corn if you have time to plan your departure. You do not leave your tools if you have time to pack your belongings. You leave everything when you are leaving in a hurry, when the urgency of departure overrides every other consideration. Keat-Seal is 5 miles from the nearest road, requiring a full-day round trip on foot through canyon terrain. The site is managed by the National Park Service, which limits visitation to a small number of permitted parties per day, and this management decision, while entirely justified from a preservation standpoint, has had the effect of keeping most Americans ignorant of the site's existence. Millions of people visit Mesa Verde every year. Hundreds visit Keat-Seal. The sites are not equal in what they offer to a visitor willing to make the effort, but the effort is prohibitive for most people, and the story Keat-Seal tells is therefore a story that very few Americans have ever encountered directly. That story includes details that are not in the visitor center exhibit at the nearest gateway facility. It includes the evidence in the masonry of multiple construction phases, some of them apparently quite rapid, suggesting that the community at Keat-Seal was growing quickly in its final years, possibly receiving an influx of people from other, already abandoned communities nearby. It includes the spatial organization of the site, which shows evidence of distinct clan or lineage sections, of boundaries between different social groups within the overall community, of a social structure more complex and more internally differentiated than the standard narrative suggests. And it includes the evidence of the abandonment, the suddenness and the completeness of it that makes the burning question of what happened so vivid and so unanswered. There is a researcher named Winston Hurst who has spent decades studying the archaeology of southeastern Utah and who has written with unusual candor about what the evidence actually shows and about the gap between that evidence and the public narrative. Hurst has documented, at multiple sites in the Cedar Mesa area, evidence of a pattern that he describes as the violence signal. Sites where the final occupation phase shows trauma on the skeletal remains, where the buildings show evidence of burning, where the artifacts suggest rapid abandonment, and where the combination of these features is too consistent and too widespread to be explained as anything other than a pattern of organized violent conflict affecting multiple communities over a relatively short period. Hurst is not a fringe figure. He is a working professional archaeologist with decades of field experience in the region. His documentation of the violence signal in the Cedar Mesa sites is not contested on the grounds that the evidence is wrong. It is, to the extent it is contested on the grounds of interpretation, on the question of what the evidence means. And the contestation of interpretation has functioned, in the public narrative, as a reason to leave the violence out of the story entirely, because contested evidence is complicated, and complicated evidence does not fit in the pamphlet. Let us talk now about water, because water is at the center of everything in the Southwest, and the relationship between the cliff dwellers and water is one of the most remarkable and least appreciated aspects of their civilization. Water in the Colorado Plateau is not simply scarce. It is distributed in ways that are profoundly irregular and deeply consequential for the communities that depend on it. A canyon that receives reliable rainfall in one decade may be drought-stricken in the next. A spring that produces consistent flow for a generation may fail completely in response to changes in the regional groundwater table. Snow accumulation in the mountains that feeds the canyon streams in spring may vary enormously from year to year, and the timing of snowmelt is as important as the total volume, because crops planted to take advantage of snowmelt water have a narrow window in which the water is both available and the temperature is warm enough for germination and growth. Living successfully in this environment required not just knowledge of where the water was in any given season, but the ability to predict, with some degree of reliability, where it would be in future seasons, and to build social and physical infrastructure that could cope with the inevitable periods when predictions failed and the water simply was not there. The water management infrastructure of the ancestral Puebloans was far more extensive and far more sophisticated than the textbook acknowledges. At Chaco Canyon, researchers have documented a complex system of water management features that includes check dams in the tributary canyons above the main canyon, earthen berms and diversion channels designed to capture and redirect rainfall runoff, and a network of features in the canyon floor designed to slow water flow and increase infiltration into the agricultural soils. The scale of this system and the sustained organizational effort required to build and maintain it is consistent with the interpretation of Chaco as a major, institutionally organized community rather than a simple village. At Mesa Verde, the evidence of water management is equally impressive and equally underappreciated. The farming community of the Mesa Top was entirely dependent on a combination of rainfall, snowmelt, and spring water, all of which required active management to support the population. Researchers have documented check dams, terraced fields, diversion channels, and reservoir features across the Mesa Top that together constitute a water management system of real complexity. The reservoirs are particularly interesting. Some of them have been analyzed and show evidence of deliberate lining with clay and stone to reduce seepage, deliberate engineering decisions made to increase the efficiency of water storage in a specific geological context. This is not the behavior of a people who are passively responding to their environment and hoping for the best. This is active, informed, sophisticated environmental management, the product of generations of accumulated knowledge about how water moves through a specific landscape and how human infrastructure can most effectively capture, store, and distribute it. And when the climate changed, when the drought of the late 13th century made the assumptions built into that infrastructure invalid, the engineering failed not because it was inadequate, but because it had been built for the conditions that existed and could not be quickly enough rebuilt for the conditions that arrived. The collapse of the Cliff City civilization was, in part, the collapse of an infrastructure that had been optimized for a climate regime that no longer existed. It was not the collapse of a primitive people overwhelmed by natural forces too large for them to manage. It was the collapse of a sophisticated civilization that had built its water management infrastructure to operate within a specific range of conditions, and found that range exceeded by a combination of drought, population pressure, and social stress that together pushed the system past its design limits. This is a story with obvious contemporary resonance. The American Southwest in the 21st century is another civilization that has built its water management infrastructure to operate within a specific range of conditions, and that is beginning to find those conditions changing in ways that the infrastructure was not designed to accommodate. The Colorado River, which provides water to tens of millions of people across 7 states, is in structural deficit. More water is allocated from it than reliably flows through it in most years, and the droughts associated with climate change are making the deficit worse. Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, has been at record or near-record low levels in recent years, exposing infrastructure and features, including archaeological sites, that have been submerged for decades. The cliff dwellers of the Southwest collapsed in part because they built their civilization on water assumptions that proved to be wrong. We may be building ours on similar assumptions and discovering a similar lesson. The ruins in the canyon walls are not just the remnants of a dead culture. They are a lesson in what happens when you build your civilization to the limits of your environment's capacity, rather than within a margin of safety. They are a message from the past addressed to the present, and we are not reading it. There is one more thread in the story of the cliff cities that needs to be pulled before we can claim to have told it honestly. It is the thread that connects the ruins to the specific American political and legal context of the late 19th and 20th centuries, the thread that explains not just what happened to the cliff cities, but what happened to our understanding of them. In 1906, the United States Congress passed the Antiquities Act, the first major piece of federal legislation specifically designed to protect archaeological sites on federal land. The Antiquities Act gave the president the power to designate national monuments to protect significant archaeological, historical, and scientific resources. Its passage was a genuine achievement, the result of sustained advocacy by a coalition of archaeologists, anthropologists, and antiquarian enthusiasts who had watched the destruction and looting of southwestern sites with increasing alarm for the previous 2 decades. But the Antiquities Act was also, in important ways, a product of its specific historical moment. It defined archaeological sites as federal resources, as property of the nation, to be managed by federal agencies according to federal priorities. This definition, while necessary for the practical purpose of protecting sites from looting and destruction, also had the effect of defining the sites in terms that effectively excluded the living communities of indigenous people who had cultural, spiritual, and historical connections to those sites. The Antiquities Act did not ask the Hopi, or the Zuni, or the other Pueblo peoples whether the ruins in their ancestral landscape were resources of the American nation. It did not acknowledge that these places had ongoing significance to living communities, that they were not dead relics of a vanished civilization but active nodes in a living cultural and spiritual landscape. It simply declared them federal property and proceeded to manage them accordingly. The consequences of this framing were significant and are still being worked through. National Park Service management of the cliff-dwelling sites has always been shaped by a fundamental tension between the legitimate need to protect fragile archaeological resources from physical damage and the equally legitimate interest of descendant communities in maintaining access to and connection with their ancestral places. This tension has been managed with varying degrees of sensitivity and success at different sites and in different periods. But it has never been fully resolved because the legal and institutional framework within which it operates does not provide adequate tools for its resolution. The modern Pueblo peoples are not passive observers of how their ancestors' sites are managed. They are active participants through formal consultation processes established by federal law and through informal relationships with site managers in the decisions about how these places are interpreted, protected, and made accessible to the public. The quality of those relationships varies enormously. In some cases, it is genuinely collaborative, genuinely respectful, and genuinely productive of a more complete and more honest interpretation of the sites than either party could produce alone. In other cases, it is perfunctory, adversarial, or corrupted by the institutional incentives of federal agencies to manage efficiently rather than to manage thoughtfully. The public interpretation of the cliff-dwelling sites, the ranger talks, and the visitor center exhibits, and the trail brochures, and the glossy coffee table books is the product of all of this. The archaeological research with its genuine achievements and its ideological blind spots, the political and legal context with its formal inclusion of indigenous perspectives and its practical limitations, and the institutional culture of the National Park Service, with its mandate to serve a broad public audience and its tendency to resolve difficult complexities by presenting simple stories. The result is a public narrative that is, by any honest assessment, significantly incomplete, not deliberately dishonest, not the product of a specific conspiracy to deceive the public about the cliff cities, but incomplete in ways that are consequential, that leave visitors with a false sense of understanding about what happened here, that miss the moral complexity and the historical tragedy and the ongoing significance of these places to the living communities who are descended from the people who built them. To tell the story more honestly requires more than archaeology. It requires listening to the Hopi elders who maintain knowledge about their ancestors' migrations. It requires engaging seriously with the oral traditions that have preserved historical memory across 7 centuries. It requires acknowledging the evidence of violence and social complexity that the comfortable narrative prefers to minimize. It requires admitting the limits of what we know and being honest about how much remains unknown. And it requires treating the living communities of the modern Southwest not as curators of an interesting supplement to the scientific story, but as authorities on a history that is their own. This is the work that is slowly, unevenly, imperfectly being done. The National Park Service has made genuine progress in recent decades toward a more collaborative and more honest interpretation of the cliff-dwelling sites. Some visitor center exhibits are significantly better than they were 20 years ago. Some ranger talks engage seriously with the perspectives of descendant communities. Some of the academic research is being conducted in genuine partnership with those communities rather than in the extractive mode of the early period. But the work is not done. The narrative is not fully honest. The story is not complete. And the ruins are still there in the cliff faces, waiting for the story to catch up with them. Let us talk now about what is perhaps the strangest and most persistent mystery of the entire Cliff City story. A mystery that the textbook does not acknowledge as a mystery at all because the textbook has a simple answer for it. But the simple answer is not an answer. It is a placeholder, a note to file that says we will figure this out eventually, and then never follows up. The mystery is, why there? Not why cliff dwellings generally, that we have addressed. The defensive logic is clear enough. But why these specific cliffs? Why this specific canyon rather than that one? Why Chaco Canyon, one of the most barren, most inaccessible, most resource-poor locations in the entire Southwest, as the center of the most ambitious construction program in the pre-Columbian North American Southwest? Chaco Canyon is not a good place to build a city by any practical metric. There is not much water, there is not much arable land, there is no timber within a reasonable distance, there is no stone immediately suitable for high-quality masonry without considerable preparation. The canyon is deep enough to block winter sunlight for a significant portion of the day in parts of the canyon floor. It is remote from every direction, and yet the Chacoans chose it. Built in it for 3 centuries, transported 200,000 timber beams 50 miles to it, maintained an elaborate road network radiating from it, and organized the lives of tens of thousands of people across a region of 25,000 square miles around it. The landscape is not obviously special, unless you know what to look for. The canyon cuts through a specific geological formation in a way that creates, in certain conditions of light, a visual effect that researchers who have spent time in the canyon have described as remarkable, a quality of reflected light from the canyon walls that is different from the surrounding landscape. The canyon floor, at specific times of year, receives patterns of shadow and light that are determined by the geometry of the canyon walls, and that create striking visual effects that would have been immediately apparent and potentially of great significance to people whose cosmological system placed enormous importance on the movement of light. This is speculative. There is no direct evidence that the Chacoans chose their canyon because of a specific quality of its light. But it is consistent with everything else we know about the Chacoan system, which was organized around the systematic observation and ceremonial marking of light and shadow, of solar and lunar phenomena, of the calendar. The Chacoans were people who paid exquisite attention to the behavior of light in specific landscapes. It would not be surprising if the specific behavior of light in Chaco Canyon was one of the reasons they were there. There are other possible reasons. The canyon has been proposed as a sacred landscape because of specific geological features. It has been proposed as a route marker, a waypoint in a larger ceremonial geography of the Southwest. It has been proposed as a site selected for astronomical observation because of specific horizon events visible from the canyon floor. None of these proposals has been definitively confirmed. All of them point toward the same general conclusion, that the selection of Chaco Canyon as the center of a civilization was not a practical decision driven by resource availability. It was a decision made on other grounds that were of enormous importance to the people who made it, but that are not immediately accessible to modern researchers working from a materialist framework. This is the final frontier of the Cliff City mystery, not the physical evidence, which is abundant and still being accumulated, not the oral traditions, which are accessible to researchers willing to engage with them respectfully, not even the institutional and political history that has shaped how we understand the ruins, but the conceptual framework, the way of thinking about the world that led the ancestors of the modern Pueblo peoples to build what they built, where they built it, and to organize their civilization around principles that make complete sense within their own cosmological framework and that are largely opaque to ours. Understanding that framework is the deepest challenge and the most important goal of the archaeology of the American Southwest. It requires not just new data, not just better technology, not just more honest historiography. It requires a genuine willingness to encounter a way of understanding the world that is not simply an earlier or more primitive version of our own, but is genuinely different from it, genuinely other, genuinely challenging to our assumptions about what counts as knowledge and what counts as important. The cliff cities were built by people who thought about the world in ways we do not fully understand. The ruins preserve the physical consequences of that thinking, in forms we can measure and analyze and date. The living communities preserve the thinking itself in forms that are still alive and still accessible. The bridge between the physical evidence and the living tradition, the conversation between the ruins and the living communities, is where the real understanding of the cliff cities will eventually be found. That conversation is happening, slowly, unevenly, with the friction and the misunderstanding that accompanies any genuine encounter between genuinely different ways of knowing. But it is happening, and its products, when they eventually reach the public in forms that are honest about their complexity, will be something extraordinary, something that changes the way we understand not just the cliff cities, but the full depth and range of human cultural achievement on this continent. For now, the walls are still standing. The windows are still waiting for the light. The ancestral knowledge is still circulating in the living communities of the Southwest, in the ceremonies and the languages and the architectural traditions and the deep, unbroken relationship with the landscape that the cliff dwellers began and that their descendants have maintained across 7 centuries of extraordinary difficulty and change. That is the real story. It is longer and harder and more beautiful and more tragic and more alive than the version in the textbook. It deserves to be heard in its full length and its full complexity. And if you have been listening to it across this long night, drifting between wakefulness and the territory where the rational mind relaxes and the older, deeper kinds of knowing begin to surface, then you have been doing exactly what you should be doing. Because some knowledge is not meant to be grasped quickly, analyzed efficiently, and filed away. Some knowledge is meant to be sat with, lived with, returned to again and again across years and decades, as your own life gives you new frameworks for understanding it. The story of the cliff cities is that kind of knowledge. You will understand something different about it at 40 than you did at 20. You will understand something different at 60 than you did at 40. The ruins will have something new to show you every time you go back. If you go back with the patience and the willingness to sit still long enough for the light to move and the stone to speak. The people who built the cliff cities were paying attention. They were paying the deepest, most sustained, most careful attention that human beings are capable of paying to the world they inhabit. They encoded the results of that attention in stone and road and astronomical alignment and oral tradition and ceremony, in forms designed to outlast any individual human lifetime, and to carry the accumulated knowledge of generations forward to generations not yet born. We are those generations. The message is still here. The question is whether we are paying enough attention to receive it. Sleep now. The canyon walls are holding whatever is left of the day's warmth, the way they always have, the way they have for 700 years of unmeasured sunsets, since the last person to live in those rooms walked out and did not come back. The stars are the same stars the cliff dwellers watched. The moon moves in the same arc it has always moved. The patterns of light and shadow in the canyon at dawn are exactly what they were when someone first noticed them and decided that a place where the light behaved like this was a place worth building something permanent, worth organizing a civilization around, worth carrying 200,000 timber beams 50 miles across the desert to be part of. They were not wrong. The light is still doing what they noticed. The canyon is still beautiful in exactly the way they found it beautiful. Whatever they understood about this place that we have not yet understood, the understanding is still there, encoded in the stone, waiting. Good night. Come back in the morning and look at the light. There is a specific kind of silence that exists inside the cliff dwellings that you cannot prepare for the first time you experience it. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of presence, of a space that has been inhabited so deeply and for so long that the inhabitation seems to persist even after the inhabitants are gone. You can stand in a room at Cliff Palace and feel, with a certainty that is more visceral than rational, that this room was alive once in a way that left a mark, a trace, an echo that has not yet fully dissipated across the 700 years since the last person walked out of it. Archaeologists are supposed to be immune to this. The discipline trains you, quite deliberately, to resist the pull of the intuitive and the emotional in favor of the analytical and the evidential. You are supposed to see the walls as data, the rooms as spatial units, the artifacts as material correlates of behavior, all of it subject to systematic analysis and interpretation through established theoretical frameworks. And this is right. This is the appropriate posture for doing science. But it is worth noting, because the textbook never does, that the cliff dwellings resist this posture in ways that other archaeological sites often do not. They are too vivid, too immediate, too powerfully evocative of the lives that were lived in them. Part of this is the preservation. The combination of the sheltering cliff and the extreme aridity has maintained organic materials that would have decomposed to nothing in almost any other environment. Wooden roof beams, not just their stumps but their full lengths, still in place, still bearing the marks of the stone axes that shaped them, woven matting on some of the room floors, plant fibers intact after 7 centuries in the dry air, corn cobs in some storage rooms, desiccated and brown but unmistakably corn cobs, the last harvest of the people who lived here, left behind when they left. The impression of a hand in the dried mud plaster of a wall, fingers spread, pushed into the material while it was still wet, preserved in the hardened surface as clearly as if it were made yesterday. That hand. Think about that hand for a moment. There is a specific human being, a person with a name that we do not know, and a life that we can only partially reconstruct from the material evidence they left behind, whose hand touched that wall and left a mark, and that mark has survived 700 years of time and is still there, legible, unambiguous, immediate. The distance between that hand and your own hand, standing in that room looking at the impression, is not 7 centuries of historical distance. It is the distance across the room. It is almost nothing. This is what the cliff dwellings do to you, if you let them. They collapse the distance between the past and the present in a way that is not mystical, but is genuinely unsettling. The past is not past in the same way in a space like this. It is present, physically present, in the form of the marks left by the people who were here, marks so specific and so immediate that the abstraction of historical distance is difficult to maintain. And this is why the cliff dwellings matter beyond their scientific significance, beyond their role in the research questions that occupy professional archaeologists, beyond their legal status as federal archaeological resources and their economic role as tourism attractions. They matter because they are a place where the full depth of the human past becomes immediately accessible in a way that academic narrative can approximate but never fully capture. They are a place where the story stops being a story and starts being an encounter. That encounter is what the textbook cannot provide and cannot adequately describe. The textbook can tell you that the cliff dwellings were built by ancestral Puebloans between 1190 and 1300 CE and abandoned in the face of drought and regional social disruption. It can tell you the square footage of Cliff Palace and the number of kivas at Pueblo Bonito. It can give you the radiocarbon dates and the dendrochronological sequences and the ceramic typological analyses that constrain the timeline of construction and occupation. What it cannot give you is that silence. What it cannot give you is the feeling of standing in a room that was last inhabited by a specific person who left the impression of their hand in the wall, and knowing that the gap between you and that person is physically present in the room around you, measurable in the distance between your hand and theirs. What it cannot give you is the understanding that comes not from reading about something, but from being in the place where the thing happened, in the air that the people who made it breathed. Looking out through the windows they looked through at the canyon they knew. Go there. If you ever have the opportunity to go there, to stand in those rooms, to walk those roads, to sit in the kiva at midday when the light falls through the ventilation shaft in the specific way that suggests it was designed to fall, go and be there. The textbook will not do it for you, and I cannot do it for you. The place itself is the only source for what the place has to give. But since most people will not go, or will not have the opportunity to go, or will not have the preparation to fully encounter what is there when they do go, the story still needs to be told in the forms that can travel. In words, in the narratives that attempt to convey not just the facts, but the weight and the significance of the facts. In the kind of long, slow, careful telling that takes the time the story actually requires. We have been taking that time tonight. We have been moving slowly through the canyon country, through the evidence and the unanswered questions and the institutional history that has shaped how the questions have been asked and how the evidence has been interpreted. We have been trying to give the story enough space to breathe, enough room for the complexity that the textbook compresses out of existence. Let me take you now to a place that is almost never mentioned in any of the popular accounts of the Cliff City world. A place that was not part of the ancestral Puebloan tradition in the narrow sense, but that was part of the broader regional system that made the Cliff Cities possible and that holds its own extraordinary mysteries. Let me take you to the Fremont culture. The Fremont people occupied the region we now call Utah, to the north of the ancestral Puebloan heartland, for roughly 1,000 years, from approximately 400 CE to 1,400 CE. They were contemporaries of the cliff dwellers, close enough geographically to have been in regular contact with them, sharing trade goods and probably ideas and people across the boundary zone between their respective territories. But they were not ancestral Puebloans. They had their own ceramic tradition, their own architectural conventions, their own rock art style, their own ways of organizing community life. The Fremont are among the most mysterious and the most underappreciated of the pre-Columbian cultures of the American West. Part of the mystery is the question of where they came from. The linguistic and genetic evidence is fragmentary and difficult to interpret. The most common view is that the Fremont were a heterogeneous set of related communities, bound together more by geographic proximity and shared material culture than by a single coherent cultural identity. But this view may reflect the limits of our evidence as much as the reality of Fremont society. What we know is that the Fremont produced some of the most spectacular rock art in North America. On canyon walls and cliff faces throughout Utah, the Fremont left thousands of figures, incised or painted or pecked into the stone, in a distinctive style that is immediately recognizable once you know what you are looking at. The figures are stylized but not simple. Many are elaborately decorated with accessories, with horned or antlered headdresses, with necklaces and earrings and other ornamentation, with details of costume and equipment that allow researchers to make inferences about the culture's material life and social organization. Others are more abstract, more geometric, more clearly in the domain of symbol and cosmology rather than representational depiction. The Fremont rock art includes some of the most technically sophisticated pre-Columbian imagery in North America. At a site called Buckhorn Wash in central Utah, a panel of painted figures extends for more than 100 feet along the canyon wall, the largest known Fremont painted panel and one of the most extraordinary pieces of pre-Columbian art in the continent. The figures are rendered in multiple colors, using mineral pigments that have survived for centuries in the sheltered overhang, with a level of compositional sophistication and technical skill that testifies to a tradition of specialized artistic production, not casual doodling on a convenient surface, but the deliberate, skilled work of people who had trained in a specific technical and aesthetic tradition. And then, around 1400 CE, the Fremont disappeared. Not as thoroughly as the cliff dwellers, not with the same drama of empty cities and unburied dead, but completely enough that the question of what happened to them is almost entirely unanswered. The archaeological record of Fremont occupation simply stops. There are no sites that show a continuous transition from Fremont material culture to the culture of any of the groups that were present in Utah in the historical period. The Fremont did not become anyone we can clearly identify. They left their rock art and their ceramics and their granary sites and their enigmatic figurines of clay, and they vanished from the archaeological record. Where did they go? There are several competing hypotheses. Some researchers have argued that the Fremont were ancestors of the modern Shoshonean peoples of the Great Basin, that the transition from Fremont material culture to the Numic-speaking cultures of the historical period was a genuine cultural transformation rather than a population replacement. Others have argued that the Fremont were displaced by the expansion of Numic-speaking populations from the west, the same expansion that may have contributed to the destabilization of the ancestral Puebloan communities to the south. Still others have argued that the Fremont were a heterogeneous assemblage that had no single fate, that different Fremont communities in different areas had different outcomes, some becoming absorbed into neighboring traditions, some dispersing entirely, some transformed into historically documented groups that we simply have not yet successfully connected to their Fremont predecessors. The honest answer is that we do not know. The Fremont are the great mystery of the pre-Columbian Great Basin, and the mystery has not been adequately communicated to the public because the Fremont do not appear in the standard narrative of American prehistory at all. They are not in the textbook. Their extraordinary rock art is not in the visitor center exhibit at Mesa Verde. Their 1,000-year presence in the landscape of the American West is not part of the public consciousness of American history. This is another lie of omission, less dramatic than the specific misrepresentations of the cliff-dwelling story, but in its own way equally significant. The Fremont are evidence that the complexity of pre-Columbian North America extended far beyond the specific communities that happen to have been intensively studied and intensively publicized. They are evidence that the story of human life in the American West before European contact was richer, more varied, more populated with distinct and sophisticated cultures than the standard narrative acknowledges. And this is true not just of the Fremont and the ancestral Puebloans and the Hohokam and the Mogollon. It is true of dozens of other cultures, less well-known and less intensively studied, whose presence in the American landscape before European contact left traces that are still there, in the rock art and the earthworks and the modified landscapes and the oral traditions of living communities, waiting to be incorporated into a full and honest account of what this continent was before 1492. That full and honest account has not been written. It may not be possible to write it from the evidence currently available, but the effort to approach it more closely than the textbook does is worth making, worth sustaining across the careers of researchers and the decades of ongoing investigation, because what is at stake is not just a more accurate history, but a more honest understanding of who we are and where we came from, all of us, in this place. The Americas were not an empty stage waiting for European actors to arrive and begin the real story. They were a world full of stories already in progress, stories of extraordinary complexity and duration, stories of civilization built and collapsed, and rebuilt and transformed across thousands of years of human engagement with specific landscapes. Those stories are still accessible, still recoverable, still capable of being told more fully and more honestly than they have been. The Cliff Cities are one chapter in one part of one of those stories, but that chapter, told in its full complexity, opens out onto something much larger, the full depth of human presence in the Americas, the full range of what people built and thought and knew and believed and lost and remembered and transmitted across the generations that preceded European contact. It is a depth that the textbook has consistently refused to honor, a range that the standard narrative has consistently failed to convey, a story that is still being told, imperfectly and incompletely, and with enormous amounts still unknown, by the researchers and the living communities and the ruins themselves. The ruins themselves. That is where we end, as we began, in the specific places, the specific stones, the specific silence. There is an alcove in the canyon country of southeastern Utah, not far from a place called Grand Gulch, where a small cliff dwelling overlooks a canyon that was once farmed and now is just beautiful, just austere and beautiful in the way that everything in the Colorado Plateau is austere and beautiful. The colors of the stone and the silence and the sky. The cliff dwelling in this alcove is small, maybe a dozen rooms, well preserved, never excavated. It sits in a shallow shelter formed by an overhang of the canyon wall, the rooms tucked back into the shadow, looking out through the open front of the alcove across the canyon and up at the opposite wall and beyond it at the sky. From the right position inside the main room of this small dwelling, there is a view. The canyon walls on both sides frame a specific segment of the horizon, a segment that includes, on the winter solstice morning, the exact point where the sun rises above the eastern canyon rim. If you were standing in that room on the morning of the winter solstice, the sun would rise in the precise center of your field of view, framed by the canyon walls as precisely as if the dwelling had been placed in this specific location, in this specific alcove, specifically to create this specific view at this specific moment of the year. Was this small, remote, never excavated, never published cliff dwelling positioned where it is, in the specific alcove it occupies, because someone chose this location, at least in part because of what you can see from it on the winter solstice morning? It is impossible to say with certainty. The evidence is circumstantial. The alignment could be accidental. But we know that the ancestral Puebloans at Chaco Canyon built astronomical alignments into their great houses with deliberate precision. We know that Betatakin and Keat Seal and other cliff dwellings are oriented in ways that are not accidental. We know that the systematic observation of solar and lunar events was a central practice of the cultural tradition that built all of these places. And we know that the view from this small, remote, anonymous alcove, on the one morning of the year when it is most dramatic and most meaningful in that cultural framework, is exactly what it would be if someone chose this place. Out of all the possible places in this landscape, because of what the sky does there on the solstice. Maybe that is what happened. Maybe a person, whose name we will never know, whose face we will never see, whose life we can only partially reconstruct from the physical evidence left in the room where they chose to build their home, looked at this alcove on a winter solstice morning and saw the sun rise in the exact center of the canyon view, and understood that this was a place where the sky and the land were speaking to each other in a language they could read, and decided that this was the place, that this was where they would build. Maybe that is what always happened. Maybe every cliff dwelling, every great house, every road alignment, every astronomical feature in the landscape of the ancestral Puebloan world is the product of someone, or many someones, paying the most careful attention they were capable of to the specific place they were in, and to what the sky was saying to the land and to them, and choosing to build their lives, their communities, their civilization in response to what they understood. If that is true, then the cliff cities are not just archaeological sites. They are a record of attention, the accumulated record of a people paying profound, sustained, intergenerational attention to the world they inhabited and building their civilization in response to what that attention revealed. And the ruins are not the evidence of a dead civilization, but the material residue of that attention, still legible if we know how to read it, still communicating if we are willing to listen. The walls are still standing. The windows are still waiting. The solstice is still coming, every year, at the same moment, sending its light through the same openings that were built to receive it, in the canyons and the alcoves of the American Southwest, where a civilization paid attention and built what it understood and left it behind for whoever came after. Whoever was willing to come close enough and stay long enough and be quiet enough to begin to understand what the attention was for. We are still learning how to be that quiet. We are still learning how to come that close. We are still, 700 years after the last person walked out of Cliff Palace and left the corn in the storage rooms and the impression of their hand in the plaster of the wall, in the very early stages of understanding what the cliff cities were and what they meant and what they still have to say. That is not a failure. That is an invitation. The ruins are patient. The light is reliable. The sky is the same sky it has always been. Come when you can, stay as long as you can, and listen. There are things the stones know that we are only beginning to hear. Let me take you somewhere that the standard tour does not go. Not a physical location, though it is rooted in physical locations. A place in the history of ideas about the cliff cities, a moment when the established narrative was seriously challenged by evidence that could not be explained away, and the response of the archaeological establishment to that evidence tells us something important about how institutional science handles findings that are genuinely threatening to its consensus. In the late 1970s, and into the 1980s, a small number of researchers working independently began to notice something about the spatial organization of ancestral Puebloan sites that had not previously been systematically addressed. The sites were not randomly distributed across the landscape. They were not positioned purely on the basis of proximity to agricultural land or water. They showed patterns of alignment and spacing, one to another across distances of miles, that were too regular and too consistent to be accidental, and that were not explained by any of the factors, environmental, agricultural, hydrological, that usually account for settlement location. The most striking of these patterns was the relationship between certain great houses at Chaco Canyon and outlier sites in the broader regional network. When researchers plotted the positions of the outliers on a map and measured the angles between them and the canyon center, they found that certain outlier pairs were positioned at angles relative to Chaco that corresponded to the directions of specific solar and lunar events as seen from the canyon. The angle between two particular outliers, as measured from the center of the canyon, corresponded within a small margin to the angle of the summer solstice sunrise. Another pair corresponded to the winter solstice sunset, another to the northern lunar standstill moonrise. This was, to put it mildly, unexpected. If correct, it implied that the entire regional system of Chaco Canyon and its outliers had been laid out, at least in part, on an astronomical plan, that the positions of communities across a region of tens of thousands of square miles had been chosen, at least in part, to create a landscape-scale astronomical instrument, a device for observing and marking the movements of celestial bodies at the scale of the landscape itself, rather than at the scale of individual buildings. The implications of this were staggering. It would mean that the organizational capacity of the Chacoan system was not just sufficient to coordinate the construction of individual great houses and the maintenance of a road network. It was sufficient to coordinate the positioning of entire communities, the founding of new settlements in specific locations chosen for astronomical reasons, across a generation-spanning building program that kept the overall plan in view while pursuing the individual elements of it one settlement at a time. This would require at minimum a stable, long-lived institutional memory that could maintain an astronomical and spatial plan across multiple human generations. It would require a governing authority capable of directing new communities to specific locations rather than allowing them to choose locations for themselves on purely practical grounds. It would require, in short, exactly the kind of institutionalized, centralized, transgenerational authority that the standard narrative is most reluctant to attribute to ancestral Puebloan society. The astronomical alignment hypothesis for the Chacoan regional system was not embraced by the archaeological mainstream. It was criticized, often harshly, for the usual reasons: insufficient evidence, confirmation bias in the selection of the data points that showed alignment, while ignoring those that did not, the application of a modern mathematical framework to a pre-modern cultural system in ways that might not correspond to how the people themselves understood what they were doing. Some of these criticisms had genuine merit. The methodology of archaeoastronomy is genuinely difficult, and the history of the field includes real cases of researchers finding patterns that turned out to be artifacts of their own analytical choices rather than genuine features of the data. But the hypothesis has not gone away. It has been refined, subjected to more rigorous analytical methods, extended to additional data points, and defended by researchers who have responded carefully to the methodological criticisms. And it remains, in the current state of the evidence, genuinely unresolved. It is not proven. It is not disproven. It is a serious scientific hypothesis about the nature of the Chacoan system that deserves continued investigation, and that the public presentation of Chaco Canyon essentially never mentions. Why does it not get mentioned? Partly because it is technically complex, and the visitor center audience is not assumed to be ready for the level of astronomical and mathematical detail required to evaluate it. Partly because it is contested and the public presentation prefers settled answers to ongoing debates. And partly, perhaps, because accepting the hypothesis would require such a radical revision of the standard picture of ancestral Puebloan social organization that the revision would undermine the entire interpretive framework within which the visitor center exhibit was designed. It is easier to say the Chacoans built impressive buildings than to say the Chacoans may have organized an entire regional civilization on an astronomically determined spatial plan that required centralized authority and transgenerational institutional memory to execute. The first statement fits in a pamphlet. The second one does not. And yet the second statement is closer to what the evidence, taken in full and considered seriously, is beginning to suggest. The Cliff City civilization was not simple. It was not what the textbook says it was. It was something more complex, more institutionally sophisticated, more deeply engaged with questions of astronomical time and sacred space, and the relationship between the human community and the movements of the cosmos than the comfortable narrative has ever managed to convey. Let us talk, one more time, about the people. Not the civilization, not the archaeological record, not the institutional frameworks that have shaped how we understand them. The people. The individual human beings who were born in these places, who grew up in these communities, who learned from their elders and taught their children, and worked and argued and made love, and grieved and died in the rooms and the plazas and the fields of the Cliff City world. We know very little about individuals. The archaeology of the pre-literate past does not give us names or voices or personal histories, but it gives us bones, and bones are intimate in ways that the other material record is not. The skeletal record of the ancestral Puebloan world has been studied with increasing sophistication over the decades, and what it reveals about the lives of individual people is both poignant and informative. The physical demands of life in the cliff-dwelling communities are legible in the bones. Evidence of heavy labor beginning in childhood is common in adult skeletons. Arthritis in the joints, stress markers in the vertebrae, modified bone structure in the arms and legs that reflects the specific physical activities that were most common in this culture. The corn-grinding posture, women kneeling for hours at a time on stone metates grinding dried corn kernels into meal, left specific skeletal signatures that bioarchaeologists have learned to identify. It was hard work, sustained daily work, beginning in adolescence and continuing for decades, and it left marks that the bones still carry. The evidence of trauma is also present. Healed fractures, evidence of injuries sustained and survived, tell stories of the accidents and the violence of daily life in a physically demanding environment. Unhealed fractures, injuries that were lethal or that the individual survived only briefly, tell more sudden and more difficult stories. Some of these traumatic injuries are consistent with falls, with the accidents that must have been common in communities where people climbed steep cliff faces as part of daily life. Others are consistent with interpersonal violence, with the blows and the wounds of conflict. The evidence of disease is there too. Chronic infectious diseases left traces in the bone that allow identification of specific pathogens in some cases. Nutritional deficiencies left their signatures. The accumulative burden of a life lived in close proximity to other people, in conditions where sanitation was difficult and infectious disease spread easily, shows in the skeletal record of populations that experienced high rates of certain childhood diseases and high rates of adult joint disease. These were not people who lived in a paradise of health and plenty. They were people who lived hard lives in a demanding environment and who bore the physical costs of those lives in their bones. And yet the material record also shows evidence of care. Skeletal remains of individuals who had survived serious, disabling injuries for years or decades, injuries that would have prevented independent survival without sustained care from others, tell a different story. A story of communities that maintained their disabled and their ill, that did not abandon those who could no longer contribute to the subsistence economy, that understood the value of individual lives beyond their economic utility. These are not the brutish primitives of the 19th century imagination. These are people who cared for each other with deliberate, sustained commitment across the years. And then there are the burials themselves, the most intimate and the most expressive form of evidence about what people believed and valued and feared. The ancestral Puebloan mortuary tradition is complex. variable across time and space, and still incompletely understood. But it consistently shows evidence of intention, of the belief that what you did with a person's body after death mattered, that the treatment of the dead had consequences that extended beyond the purely practical. The placement of grave goods, the orientation of the body, the use of pigment, the positioning of the burial in relation to the architectural structure of the living community, all of these choices reflect a cosmological framework in which death was not an ending but a transition, in which the dead remained part of the community in some form and could be honored, propitiated, or communicated with through the appropriate ritual acts. This is the living tradition of the modern Pueblo peoples, expressed in material form in the burials of their ancestors. When we see that living tradition in the modern ceremonial life of the Hopi and the Zuni and the Rio Grande Pueblo peoples, and we recognize its continuity with the mortuary practices of the cliff-dwelling era, we are seeing something remarkable, a thread of cultural transmission stretching back 7 centuries or more, maintained across the catastrophic disruption of the Cliff City collapse and the colonial period and everything that followed, in the ceremonies and the beliefs and the practices of communities that are still here, still performing these traditions, still honoring the ancestors in ways that their ancestors would have recognized. That continuity is itself an extraordinary achievement, arguably as extraordinary as the cliff cities themselves. To maintain a cultural tradition across 7 centuries of disruption, to preserve the core of a ceremonial life through abandonment and migration and colonial violence and cultural suppression, requires a kind of institutional resilience and cultural commitment that the standard narrative, with its focus on the ruins and its relative neglect of the living communities, consistently fails to honor. The Cliff City civilization did not die. It transformed, survived, adapted, and is still here. And the story of that survival, of the 7 centuries between the abandonment of Cliff Palace and the present day, is at least as interesting and at least as full of unacknowledged complexity as the story of the Cliff Cities themselves. But that is a story for another night. That is a story that begins in the migrations of the late 13th century and passes through the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, through the Reconquista, through the Long Walk of the Navajo, through the boarding school era, through the Indian Reorganization Act, through the decades of the 20th century, when the US government simultaneously declared itself the protector of indigenous cultural heritage and continued the systematic suppression of indigenous languages and ceremonial practices. That story ends, if it ends anywhere, in the present moment, with the living Pueblo communities asserting their sovereignty, their cultural rights, their relationships with their ancestral places in a legal and political landscape that is still inadequate to the full recognition of what they are and what they have maintained. We owe them more than the textbook gives them. We owe the Cliff Cities more than the pamphlet gives them. We owe the full, complex, uncomfortable, extraordinary story of what happened in the canyon country of the American Southwest, more than the 20-minute visitor center experience that turns it into a background for photographs. The debt is not paid by reading this, or by listening to it in the dark as you drift towards sleep, but it begins to be paid by taking the story seriously, by carrying it forward, by remaining curious about the questions that do not have settled answers, and by refusing to accept the false certainty of the simplified narrative in place of the genuine uncertainty of the complex one. The Cliff Cities are still there. The walls are still standing, the windows are still waiting, and somewhere in New Mexico and Arizona, in the living Pueblo communities whose ancestors built those walls, there are people who carry knowledge about those places that no archaeologist has yet learned to ask for in the right way, in the right spirit, with the right relationship. When that knowledge is finally shared, fully and honestly, and on terms that honor those who carry it, what we know about the Cliff Cities will change. What we understand about the full depth and range of pre-Columbian civilization in North America will change. What we know about ourselves, as people living on this continent in this moment, connected by geography and history and the shared human project of making meaning in a difficult and beautiful world, will change. That change is coming. It is already beginning, slowly, unevenly, with the friction that always accompanies genuine intellectual transformation. The story of the cliff cities is not finished. It will not be finished in our lifetimes. But it is moving, it is alive, it is still capable of surprising us. And that is exactly what it should be doing. Because the places and the people it is about were never as simple as the story we told about them. The canyon is dark now. The fire that warmed those rooms is long cold. The last person who slept under those stone ceilings, curled against the chill of the high desert night, listening to the wind in the canyon and the distant sound of water in the seasonal stream below, is 7 centuries gone. But the canyon is still there. The ceilings are still there. The wind is still the same wind. And the questions that those rooms raise about who built them and why and what happened and where the builders went and what they knew and what we have lost of what they knew, those questions are still as alive and as urgent and as interesting as they have ever been. Come back to them in the morning. Come back to them with fresh eyes and an open mind and the patience to sit with what is not yet answered. The ruins will still be there. The light will still be doing what it has always done. And the story will still be waiting to be told more fully and more honestly than it has been. That is what ruins are for. Not for photographs, not for visitor center exhibits, not for the simplified narrative of the pamphlet. Ruins are for returning to, again and again, with everything you have learned since the last time, finding something you missed, asking a question you had not thought to ask before, being reminded that the world is older and stranger and more richly inhabited across time than any single narrative can contain. Return to the canyon. Return to the question. The walls will be there, and in the walls, the prints of the hands. And in the prints of the hands, the specific presence of the specific people who made them, still reaching across the centuries toward anyone willing to pay the kind of attention they paid. The patient, total, intergenerational attention that built a civilization in the faces of cliffs and encoded the movements of the sky into the stones and left it all there for us to find. When we are finally ready to understand what we are looking at, we are still becoming ready. That is the work of our time. In this particular part of the long story of human beings in this extraordinary place. And it is good work. It is the right work. It is the kind of work that the ruins demand of everyone who stands in their silence and feels the weight of all those years pressing in from every direction. The geological time of the canyon walls, the human time of the rooms and the roads and the road alignments, and the ongoing living time of the communities whose ancestors made all of it, and whose presence and whose knowledge are still here, still part of the story, still waiting for the conversation that the story demands. Good night. Come back when the light is right. There is one more thing I want to say before the night closes in fully. One more thread in the story that needs to be pulled before we rest. It is about the land itself. The Colorado Plateau, the vast highland region centered on the four corners where the cliff cities were built, is one of the most geologically dramatic landscapes on Earth. It is a place where the processes that shape the surface of the planet are visible in their full grandeur, where the layers of rock that underlie the canyon walls record hundreds of millions of years of geological history, in colors that range from the deep red of iron-rich sandstone to the creamy white of ancient limestone, to the chocolate brown of shale deposited in the beds of shallow Jurassic seas. This is not background. The geology of the Colorado Plateau was not simply the stage on which the human story played out. It was an active participant in that story, shaping the specific forms of the landscape in which the cliff-dwelling communities lived, determining the availability of specific resources, creating the specific microclimates and water regimes that made certain places habitable and others not, generating the specific hazards that the cliff dwellers navigated daily. The cliff cities exist where they exist because the geology made the alcoves. The alcoves exist because the Colorado Plateau's specific geological character produces a specific pattern of erosion in which the Navajo and Entrada sandstone formations crack and peel and weather in ways that create the undercut alcoves, the sheltered overhangs, the deep recesses in the canyon walls that the cliff dwellers turned into homes. To understand the cliff cities fully, you have to understand the rock. You have to understand why the alcoves exist, how they form, what determines their size and their orientation and their depth, and how the people who lived in them understood and used the specific properties of the sandstone that contained them. The cliff dwellers were not working against the grain of the rock. They were working with it, following the natural logic of a material they understood intimately, building with the stone that the canyon walls provided, adapting their architecture to the specific forms that the erosion had produced. This relationship between the builders and the geological material is one of the most underappreciated aspects of cliff-dwelling architecture. The masonry traditions of the ancestral Puebloans were developed specifically for the materials available in the canyon country. The flat-bedded sandstone that splits naturally into blocks of useful size and shape, the clay deposits that served as mortar and plaster, the specific properties of the stone that determined how it could be worked and how it would behave under load. The extraordinary masonry of Pueblo Bonito was not developed in the abstract and then applied to this specific stone. It was developed through centuries of working with this specific stone, learning its properties, pushing its limits, exploiting its specific character. The cliff dwellers were, in the deepest sense, children of the canyon country. They were formed by it, shaped by it, adapted to it over generations until the relationship between the community and the landscape was so intimate and so specific that moving to a different geological environment would have been, in important ways, moving to a different world. When they left, they were not just leaving their homes. They were leaving the specific landscape that had made them who they were, whose rocks they knew by name and whose water sources they had mapped in memory across generations and whose seasonal rhythms they had encoded in ceremony and calendar and architectural alignment. They were leaving the stones that held the impressions of their hands and the windows that framed the solstice sunrise and the roads that connected them to each other and to the sky. They were leaving a world they had made, fitted to themselves across centuries, and going somewhere else to begin again. That departure, whatever its immediate causes, was a profound rupture. The communities that reformed in the Rio Grande Valley and on the Hopi Mesas were not the same communities that had inhabited the cliff cities. They were communities of survivors, of people who had carried what they could carry, knowledge and ceremony and identity, and the deep cultural memory of the places they had left, and who were beginning the work of building new communities in new landscapes that did not yet carry their imprint. That work took generations. The new communities in the south and east had to learn new landscapes, develop new agricultural systems, negotiate new relationships with the peoples already living in the territories into which they were moving, and reconstruct something like the social and ceremonial life that the Cliff City world had provided from new materials in new conditions. The modern Pueblo communities are the product of that reconstruction, and the fact that they are still here, still vital, still maintaining the cultural traditions that connect them to the Cliff City world, is evidence of a resilience and an adaptability that deserves to be recognized as one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of human civilization in North America. The story of the Cliff Cities is, in the end, a story about time, about the deep time of the geological landscape that made the alcoves, about the human time of the thousands of years of accumulated cultural development that produced the civilization that built the Cliff Cities, about the historical time of the 300 years of Chacoan fluorescence and the cliff-dwelling era and the collapse, about the living time of the 7 centuries since the abandonment, in which the descendants of the cliff dwellers have maintained their cultural traditions and their relationships with the land across every obstacle that history has placed in their way, and about the ongoing time of the present, in which the ruins and the living communities and the researchers and the public are all still engaged with the questions that the cliff cities raise, still working toward an understanding that is not yet complete, still paying attention to stones and skies and oral traditions and analytical methods that continue to reveal things we had not previously known. All of these timescales are real, all of them are relevant, and the story that contains all of them is the story worth telling, the story that the cliff cities deserve, The story that does justice to the extraordinary complexity and depth of what happened in the canyon country of the American Southwest before, during, and after the brief, brilliant, violent, beautiful century of the cliff cities themselves. That story is still being told. It will continue to be told. And each telling that is more honest, more complete, more respectful of the evidence and of the living communities that carry the memory of these places, is a step toward the understanding that the ruins have been waiting for. The walls are still standing. The light is still moving through the windows. The hands are still pressed into the plaster. The stars are still the same stars. Pay attention. The story is not over, and the ruins are patient. They have been waiting 700 years already. They can wait a little longer for us to learn how to hear what they are saying. But let us not make them wait too much longer. Let us come closer. Let us be quieter. Let us stay longer than the pamphlet suggests, and look more carefully than the visitor center exhibit prepares us to look. Let us take the story seriously in its full complexity and carry it forward with the honesty it deserves. The cliff cities were built by people who paid attention. The least we can do is pay attention in return. Good night. The canyon is quiet. The stars are turning. Somewhere in the dark, the walls are still standing, and in the morning the light will do what it has always done. Sleep well. Come back when the light is right. There is always more to see. There are moments in the history of any discipline when the accumulated weight of evidence becomes impossible to ignore, when the questions that have been quietly accumulating in the margins of the mainstream narrative finally force themselves into the center and demand an accounting. American archaeology is at one of those moments now, or approaching it, and the cliff cities of the Southwest are among the places where the accounting will have to happen. The questions are not going away. The evidence of astronomical sophistication at Chaco Canyon is not going away. The evidence of violence and social stratification in the final phases of the cliff-dwelling occupation is not going away. The evidence of sustained contact with Mesoamerican civilizations is not going away. The evidence, in the oral traditions of the modern Pueblo peoples, of a historical memory that corresponds in specific and verifiable ways with the archaeological record, is not going away. All of these things are real, documented, supported by multiple lines of independent evidence, and persistently underweighted in the public narrative of what the cliff cities were. What is going away, slowly and not without resistance, is the comfortable simplicity of the story that has been told in the visitor centers and the textbooks and the coffee table books for the past century. That story had virtues. It was accessible. It was not threatening. It allowed the cliff cities to be appreciated as impressive achievements, without requiring the kind of fundamental revision of assumptions about pre-Columbian cultural complexity that a fuller accounting would demand. And it served, however inadvertently, the ideological interests of a culture that needed the indigenous past of the Americas to be safely categorized as primitive and pre-civilizational, safely located in a world that was fundamentally different from and inferior to the civilization that replaced it. That need is not as pressing as it once was. The ideological work that the simplified narrative of the cliff cities was recruited to do is not as necessary as it once was, because the ideological framework it served is itself, slowly and unevenly and with considerable resistance, losing its grip on mainstream American culture. We are not where we need to be, but we are further from where we started than we sometimes remember. And the cliff cities, told honestly, can be part of the story of how we got here and how we continue to move. The ruins are not just evidence of the past. They are a resource for the present, a source of questions and challenges and perspectives that the present moment needs. The question of how a civilization manages scarcity, the question of how social stratification develops and what it costs, the question of how societies respond to environmental stress, and what kinds of responses work and what kinds fail, the question of how knowledge is transmitted across generations, and what happens when the transmission is interrupted. All of these are questions that the Cliff City record raises with an immediacy and a specificity that more distant historical examples cannot match. We are a civilization managing scarcity in a landscape where water is becoming less reliable. We are a society dealing with the consequences of social stratification that the evidence suggests has real costs for the coherence and the resilience of complex communities. We are facing environmental stress at a scale that our infrastructure was not designed to accommodate, and the question of whether we will respond adequately and in time is genuinely open. And we are in a moment of challenge to the transmission of knowledge, when the acceleration of change and the fragmentation of shared information environments is making it harder and harder to maintain the kind of deep, intergenerational knowledge transmission that the Cliff City civilization depended on, and that its collapse, in part, represents the failure of. The Cliff Cities are a mirror. They are a place where we can look at ourselves from a sufficient distance that the patterns become visible, where we can see the shape of what a complex civilization under stress looks like before the final chapter. While there is still time to ask whether the patterns that led to the collapse are patterns we recognize in our own moment, this is not a comfortable observation. It is not the kind of observation that the visitor center pamphlet wants to make, because the visitor center pamphlet does not want to disturb the equanimity of the family road trip, but it is what the ruins are there to offer to anyone willing to stay long enough and be quiet enough to receive it. The Cliff Cities are patient. They have been waiting a long time. They will wait longer, and the light will keep doing what it has always done, marking the turnings of the year with a precision that does not require our attention to remain accurate, that has been accurate for 700 years of unobserved solstices and will remain accurate for 700 more. But we are here now. The light is happening now. The walls are standing now, in this specific moment of the long story of the human engagement with this land, and we have the opportunity, available only now and not again in this specific form, to pay the kind of attention that the people who built those walls paid, the total, sustained, intergenerational attention that turned a landscape into a civilization. We may not be able to sustain it across generations the way they did. The conditions of modern life work against that kind of sustained attention in ways that the Canyon country did not work against it. But we can begin. We can pay attention in this moment to this story, to these questions, to the specific places and the specific people and the specific achievements and the specific failures that the Cliff City record makes visible to anyone willing to look closely enough. That is what this story has been asking of you across this long night. Not to become an archaeologist, not to travel to the Canyon country and stand in the ruins, though if you ever have the chance, take it. Just to pay attention, to take the story seriously, to carry the questions forward, to resist the simplicity of the pamphlet, and hold open the space for the complexity that the evidence actually demands. The Cliff Cities were built by people who paid attention. They left what they built in the care of time, which has kept it faithfully, and time has delivered it to us. In this moment, in this conversation between the ruins and anyone willing to listen, listen. The walls are speaking, the light is moving, the hands are in the plaster, reaching forward across 7 centuries toward you. Pay attention. It is the least and the most that the ruins ask. One last thing before silence. The way we understand history is not neutral. Every choice about what to include, what to emphasize, what to gloss over, what to omit entirely, is a choice with consequences that ripple outward through the culture that makes it. The choice to tell the story of the Cliff Cities as a simple environmental narrative, drought and migration and peaceful relocation, is a choice that has consequences for how we understand the pre-Columbian past of North America, how we relate to the living indigenous communities that are descended from the Cliff City builders, how we think about our own civilization's relationship to the land it occupies and the resources it consumes. The honest version of the story, the version that includes the evidence of violence and the astronomical sophistication and the Mesoamerican connections and the complexity of the collapse and the survival of the living traditions, is a harder story to tell. It requires more time. It requires more willingness to sit with uncertainty. It requires more respect for the complexity of the evidence and for the people whose descendants are still here to offer their own frameworks for understanding it. But it is the right story to tell, and it is the story that the ruins themselves are telling, for anyone willing to stand in them long enough and quietly enough to hear it. The cliff cities of the American Southwest are not the simple story of a simple people in a harsh land. They are evidence of a civilization of genuine depth, genuine sophistication, genuine tragedy, and genuine survival. They are evidence of human beings paying the deepest possible attention to the world they inhabited, and building something extraordinary in response to what that attention revealed. They are evidence of collapse and resilience and transformation, and the persistence of cultural memory across centuries of disruption and change. And they are evidence that the story of the human past in the Americas is far richer and far more complex and far more worthy of the kind of careful, honest, sustained attention that the ruins themselves embody than the version in the textbook has ever managed to convey. That is the story, not finished, not settled, not safe to package into a pamphlet, but real, documented, supported by the evidence of the stone and the bone and the pottery and the astronomical alignment and the oral tradition and the living ceremony of the communities whose ancestors made all of it. Carry it with you. Come back to it. Pay attention to the light. The canyon is waiting. The ruins are patient. And the hands in the plaster are still reaching forward across 7 centuries of morning light toward whoever comes next. That is you. That is all of us. That is what the cliff cities were built for, whether the people who built them knew it or not. To outlast their builders, to carry the evidence of what they knew and how they lived and what they built and what they lost into the future, into this moment, into the conversation we are still in the early stages of learning how to have honestly. The story continues, the ruins continue, the light continues, and the questions continue, exactly as they should, exactly as the evidence demands, open and alive and patient as stone. Sleep now. The canyon is quiet. The stars are the same stars. In the morning, the light will come through the same windows it has come through for 700 years of solstice mornings, marking the same turning of the year that the people of these rooms marked and celebrated and built their lives around. They are gone, but what they built remains. And what they knew, at least in part and at least in outline, is still recoverable, still available, still waiting for the attention that it deserves and that we are slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely learning to give it. Good night. There is one thing the stone cannot tell you, one thing that the archaeological record does not contain and cannot yield, no matter how carefully it is analyzed or how sophisticated the analytical methods become. It cannot tell you what it felt like. It cannot tell you what it felt like to wake up in those rooms, pressed against the cold stone of the cliff face, watching the first light move across the opposite canyon wall as the sun cleared the eastern rim. It cannot tell you what it felt like to carry a child on your back up the handholds carved into the cliff to reach the ledge where the rooms were. It cannot tell you what it felt like to grind corn for hours in the kneeling posture that the skeletons record in their worn joints and their modified bone structure. It cannot tell you what it felt like to watch the sun dagger bisect the spiral petroglyph at noon on the summer solstice and know, because you had been taught to know, what that precise moment meant in the ceremonial calendar of your people. Those things are gone. They are not recoverable through archaeology. They exist only, and even then only approximately and partially and in forms shaped by the centuries of transformation that separate then from now, in the living traditions of the communities whose ancestors lived them. And that is why the living communities matter to the story of the cliff cities in a way that no amount of archaeological analysis can substitute for. They carry what the stone cannot. They carry the felt knowledge, the embodied knowledge, the knowledge that lives in ceremony and in song, and in the specific way that certain words in certain languages encode relationships between people and landscapes and skies that the archaeological record can only gesture toward from the outside. The full story of the cliff cities requires both. It requires the meticulous work of archaeology, the dating and the spatial analysis and the chemical analysis, and all the other tools that the modern discipline has developed to extract information from the physical record. And it requires the engagement with living knowledge, with the traditions and the perspectives and the frameworks of understanding that the descendant communities maintain. Neither alone is sufficient. G. Together, approached with equal respect and equal intellectual rigor, they can begin to approach something like the truth of what happened in those canyons, and why, and what it means. That approach is the work of our time. It is unfinished. It will remain unfinished. But it is the right work, and the ruins are patient, and the living communities are still here, and the conversation is possible, and that is enough. That is more than enough to keep going. Sleep well. The work continues in the morning.